Chapter 9. Alas, poor Helia. Phil had been struck down by a rush of blood to the brain. For a long time he had been living as in a dream. His fits of absent-mindedness had already amazed Suzanne. Too artificial a life, constant exasperation, his fierce persistence at work which was beyond his present strength, and the ravages of a fixed idea had prepared him for brain fever. The ruin of his guitar picture was the last blow. Suzanne quickly drove Socrate out of the room, and took the mattress which was lying on the floor and put it back in its place. She hastily made the bed, and then, with the help of Puffail, placed Phil on it. He was still without motion, pale and bloodless, like a dead man. Suzanne ran to the Charite Hospital. She was acquainted with some of the young hospital doctors, and she explained the case as well as she could. One of them followed her to Phil's studio and made a long examination of him. As soon as he entered the disordered room with its tale of want, the young doctor understood all. He had already cared for victims like this of the ideal. 118. Phil came back to life and moaned feebly. "He is not dead," Suzanne said. "People don't die like that," the doctor replied, continuing his examination. "Tell me how it happened." Suzanne told the doctor everything. "It is as I thought," he said. "Well, pull him out of it. But, first of all, take away all those canvases, put the room in order, and those portraits of a young girl, always the same one, there along the wall, take them all away. You must deliver him from that vision when he comes back to himself." "But he can't live without her," Suzanne said. The doctor smiled sadly. "If he only remembers her," he murmured. "No lesion, long overdoing followed by anemia, too strong emotion, and doubtless some fixed idea." The young doctor rambled on as he looked at the portraits of Helia which Puffail was taking down. "It's a kind of intoxication of the nervous system, a railway brain, as it were. Well, give him things to build him up, and rest in silence in the meantime." "Doctor," Puffail stammered, livid with fear, "is the disease catching?" "No fear," the doctor answered, as he glanced at the hairy face of Puffail, with its crimson health. "It only comes from exaggerated intellectual functions." "Oh, I'm better already," said Puffail, reassured. Phil was delirious for a week. His mind, sunk in abysses of sleep, made obscure efforts to come back to the light of day. Sometimes an ocean of forgetfulness rolled him in its waves. Sometimes 119 great flashes of light illuminated his consciousness in its least details and gave to his dreams the hard relief of marble. Oftenest he simply wandered, mingling Helia and Suzanne, seeing in his nightmare guitars, yellow on one side and blue on the other, like worlds lighted up at once by sun and moon, a whole sky full of guitars, amid which, motionless, the skull of the poet, painter, sculptor, musician thought constantly, never sleeping until the thought burned like a red-hot iron. And then Phil put his hand to his own burning forehead and asked for something to drink. But there was someone to anticipate his wish. A gentle hand raised his head on the pillow and an anxious face bent over him, seeking to read his eyes, now dulled and now brilliant with the light of fever. "Is it Helia?" Phil asked. "It is I," Helia answered. "Don't speak, rest. You must rest." Yes, Helia had come back. Suzanne, in her belief that Phil was on the point of dying, had not been able to resist the impulse to write to her. It did not occur to Helia to ask if the disease was catching. She gave up everything. She paid her forfeit, took her leave of absence, her own good money going to pay another attraction as a substitute. Nearly all her savings went in this way, but she heeded it not. Nothing in the world would have held her back. She had to be with Phil. She alone had the right to tend him. Another with her own betrothed in time of danger? No. Helia nursed him night and day. Suzanne helped 120 her, and Puffail did the errands, going for food to Mere Michel's and for scuttles of coal to the charbonnier. From morning to night his heavy shoes shook the staircase. "Why don't you give him wine?" he said, as he looked at the sick man. "Why not goat's milk cheese?" retorted Suzanne. "Will you keep silence, Grandnigod? Go and get some wood." "And the money to buy it with?" "Here," Helia said. With what joy Helia watched Phil's progress toward health. "Dear, dear friend, my little St. John," Phil said to her, "how can I ever thank you for all you are doing for me?" He kissed her hand or put it to his burning forehead. Once he rose up and looked around the room, saying, "Who is there?" "It is I, Helia." "Who is Helia?" "Helia, your friend, or Helia. I am here with Suzanne." "Out, wretches," and he fell back exhausted. "Leave him alone," said the young doctor. "In a fortnight he will be on his feet and I'll send him to the country." Helia, who was forced to depart, went away. Her leave was over. Besides, she had no more money. Phil grew better and better. At first he was surprised to find his room so changed. 121. "Where are my pictures?" he asked. "What have you done with them?" "We've put them one side. You can see them later," answered Suzanne. "What were they about?" inquired Phil. "Anyway, it's all the same to me." The young doctor, with the good fellowship that binds students together, accompanied him to a public sanatorium not far from Paris. From that moment Phil changed visibly. He who had been so anemic in the vitiated atmosphere of his studio, with his nose always over his oils and colors, and his eyes fixed on the canvas in Socrates' company, had now abundance of pure air and walks through the open fields. He felt himself reborn, although his head was a little empty and his body stiff and sore like one just taken from the torture rack. But good food and quiet did wonders for him. He had an excellent constitution, made for work and struggle, and it came up again. With a beefsteak an idea would arrive, and with a glass of wine joy entered his heart. His blood, renewed, gave him new feelings. He had again become a man, after the illness in which his youth had been shipwrecked. Helia, anxious to see him, came back one day. How difficult it had been for her, slave to her profession as she was, and still bound to it for many months. Never Minch came. Phil was better. Phil was cured. She would have his first smile. He would be her Phil in health as in sickness. But at the gate of the sanatorium a magnificent guardian, adorned with brass buttons and a 122 gilt-banded cap, stopped her. It was society closing its doors to the intrusion of vagabonds. This man of law and order asked Helia why, how, in whose name, by what right, she wished to see Phil, and he refused the favor to her. The mountebank would one ever seen the like, pretended to be his betrothed. Phil came back to Paris cured. Strength and the daring of courage returned with him. His long rest seemed to have increased his energy tenfold. He went forth from his past as one escapes from a prison, without even looking backward. The young doctor had guessed only too truly. Phil had forgotten many things. Phil, who had received some unexpected money from his uncle in Virginia, now changed his courtier and set himself up in better style, and the Salon medal gave him his start. His professor made him acquainted with the Duke of Morgana, who ordered from him the great decorative picture of Morgana. The Comtesse de Dongian asked his aid for her charity sale. One effort and then another, and this time Phil would reach the goal. He had one of those happy dispositions which attract luck as the magnet attracts iron filings. He was ready. Life was open before him like slack water at sea. There was only wanting to him a good breeze to swell his sail. From what side was it to blow? 123. A magnificent guardian stopped her. 125. Chapter 10. Miss Ethel Rohrer of Chicago. The breeze blew from the west. Miss Ethel Rohrer, daughter of the great Red Mount Rohrer, had just arrived in Paris. She was preceded by the fame of her father, the famous Chicagoan, a business Napoleon. From his office, the center of a network of telegraph and telephone lines, he communicated with the financial universe, and his tremendous toil was building up a worldwide fortune. He thought himself poor, for he had not yet reached the billion mark, but his fame grew. Ethel adored this father. She was proud that men spoke of him. She felt herself a part in his glory. But, really, she could have wished people should pay less attention to herself. Every day the society papers devoted space to her. Yesterday evening, Miss Ethel Rohrer, daughter of the famous milliardaire, was present at the opera and so forth, and there followed a description of her dress. Tomorrow, Miss Ethel Rohrer, daughter of the famous milliardaire, accompanied by her grandmother, will be present at the horse show. They told how she passed her day. People learned that she had tried on gowns at Paquin's, chosen a head at 126 Stags, eaten chocolates at Marquis, while in reality she had stayed at home with Grandma. All this gossip annoyed her. One day, however, she laughed heartily. She learned from a paper her intention of buying the tomb of Richard the Lion-Hearted to make a bench of it in her hall at Chicago. This earned for Ethel a newspaper article, grave and patriotic. "Foreigners touch not our illustrious dead," was the journalist's conclusion in the Evening Tocsin. Richard the Lion-Hearted went the rounds of the headlines of the Paris yellow press. Then, one fine day, the papers spoke of an interview of the ex-Empress Eugenie with Miss Ethel Rohrer, daughter of the famous milliardaire R.K. Rohrer. Villeklish, in his Tocsin, had seen and heard everything. He accused America of mixing itself up with French politics. Miss Ethel did not read the article, otherwise she might have gathered that the Tocsin was very ill-informed. That she had seen the Empress was true, but there had been no word of politics. The Empress was making a short stay in Paris, as she did every year. Her sorrows had given the former sovereign the love of retirement. She passed her days by her window at the hotel, sometimes looking sadly toward the empty place where the Tuileries had been. "I see by the paper that Miss Ethel Rower is in Paris," the Empress said one day to her dame de compagnie. "Is it the granddaughter of the Rower I knew?" The Emperor had great esteem for him. "I remember him well. Mr. Rower was charged by the government at Washington with a report on the Exposition 127 of 1867. My husband loved to look into everything himself. Social questions were near to his heart, and it happened that in the evenings he would receive Mr. Rower in his private cabinet. The extreme simplicity and moral robustness of the man struck the Emperor. He found him full of new ideas which he would have wished to apply in France. I was present at one of their conversations. My little son was playing around them." "Ma chère amie," Eugenie continued, "I remember it as if it I should have been astonished if it were not so," said Eugenie. The Emperor foresaw the success of Mr. Rower. He knew men. She at once made known to Miss Rower that she would be happy to receive her, and Ethel came. Entering, she saw but one thing. In an armchair by the window a lady, with her head covered by a black mantilla, sat in the clear sunlight like a dark figure of sorrow. "Madam," said the lady-in-waiting, "I present to you Miss Ethel Rower." Ethel saw the dark figure rise from the chair. "Thank you for coming," Eugenie said. "I am glad when people come to see me," and she held out her hand. Ethel bore the hand to her lips and bowed with a grace which charmed Eugenie. "Be seated, Miss Rower," said the Empress. "Here, beside me," and she pointed with the slender hand of an aged woman to a seat. Ethel sat down. She was in the presence of Eugenie 128 de Guzman and Porto Carrero, Countess of Teba, Marquise of Mopa and Kirkpatrick, Empress of the French, Eugenie the Beautiful, the Beloved, and it was an old lady warming herself in the sun and looking around timidly. "How happy I am, madam," said Ethel, "to thank you for the kindnesses shown long ago to my grandfather. His Majesty the Emperor loaded him with favors." The Empress was greatly touched by the sincere accents of Ethel and her faithful remembrance. No one thanked her, now that she was nothing, and this daughter of a milliardaire had not forgotten slight kindnesses done long ago to her grandfather. "I thank you," she said. "The Emperor had great esteem for your grandfather. He liked to talk with him. Mr. Rower was a remarkable man. Rather, he was a man," added the Empress, who had seen so many who were not men. Ethel blushed with pleasure. Newspaper headlines constantly made sport of her family, and here was the one-time arbitress of Europe glorifying her grandfather and saying to her, "I thank you." Then they chatted for a while. Eugenie admired this young girl in her simple elegance and superb health. At the court itself she had never seen a figure more princess-like and radiant. "When I was a little girl," Ethel said, "my grandfather often spoke to us of those days of glory." At the word glory Eugenie interrupted her. "Miss Ethel and Empress Eugenie." "Miss Rower," she said, pointing with her hand 131 toward the Tuileries, "see what remains of it. There is nothing left. All has passed. All has changed around me. This was once my Paris. It is now yours. I say yours, for don't you see, mademoiselle, the true sovereigns are young girls like you with their grace and health. To you the world belongs. Ah, what happiness it is to be young." There was a moment of silence. The dame de compagnie was arranging flowers in a vase. The Empress sat dreaming. Did she see again the 18 years of power wherein she held in her hand the scepter of France, or the palace which had been destroyed, crumbled into dust, leaving not a rack behind? Did she think of Miss Rower, today's young queen, who came to pay her tribute of respect to the royalty of other days, of the conquering force which this young girl represented, the supreme outcome of an ambitious race, of the temptations without number which would assail a creature so spoiled by fate? Ethel made a motion to take her leave. The Empress rose painfully. "Madam," Ethel began. "Allow me. I wish to accompany you," Eugenie insisted. "Your visit has done me good." She leaned lightly on Miss Rower's shoulder as she crossed the room. "Miss Rower, one am going to tell you a great secret," said the Empress as she was taking leave. "But one must have been an empress to appreciate it rightly. It is this: remain always simple and artless as you were at 15. That is the secret of happiness. There is no 132 other. Believe me. Adieu, mademoiselle. I wish you all happiness in life." Ethel retained through life the vision of this woman in her mourning garments, with the white hair crowning her forehead. She recalled her gentle voice, her refined features still resembling the portraits of other days, but without the adorable smile. Our people, Ethel said to her grandmother, interest themselves only in Marie Antoinette and the Princess de Lamballe. I wish to make a collection concerning the Empress Eugenie, photographs, statuettes, and I will take back to Chicago her portrait in oils. We'll have it done here in Paris under my direction. Who is this Phil who, they say, has so much talent and has painted so fine a portrait for the salon? A young girl seated among flowers with doves around her. Cecilia Bose admires it immensely. He has had a second medal. I believe he has everything he needs to succeed, and he is an American, they say, and poor and ambitious. He is poor and ambitious? Give him a chance, replied Grandma. 133. Chapter 11. An apartment in the Latin Quarter. Nothing remained for Ethel but to meet her artist. An opportunity soon offered itself at the Comtesse de Dongeon's 5 o'clock tea, at which she was often present. Ethel, first of all, had looked for an apartment for her own convenience. The hotel, thanks to Villaclash, was becoming intolerable. Foreigners, stay at home. The tocsin printed, remember the night of the 13th March, 1871, of the day of November 22, 1876. Respect the verdict of the 363. Tremble, the people is bristling its mane of the 16th May, and bears its claws of the 14th July. Would have done better to stay in Chicago, said Grandma. At first the torrent of carriages and automobiles and bicycles flowing day and night before her window had amused Ethel, but soon she tired of it. There were, indeed, theaters and parks, and visits to dressmakers and society calls. But the theaters were impossible. The parks were only parks after all. The visits to dressmakers were anything but amusing. It's so easy to buy. And as to society, Ethel wished to rest a little for a change. 134. To speak 4 languages, including my own, to play 3 instruments, including the harp, which only needs passable arms so the DOESNT count. I must go to painting again. Oh, I wish I could have a picture on the line and a salon medal. I wish I could do a work on La Salle's explorations at the Bibliothèque Nationale. What would I not give to write like Princess Trubetskoy or paint like Cecilia Bose? I am tired of all this idleness. I wish to work. I wish to be something by myself, and not merely the daughter of Papa. I wish that Grandma. Let's go to the Latin Quarter. I will be just a student girl living with her good grandmother while she studies art. Let's go, then, to the Latin Quarter, Ethel, said Grandma, who would have followed Ethel to the end of the world. We shall be as well off there as Harrier. Let's go back to America if you wish. For my part, one prefer new countries. But the Latin Quarter shall be new for you. You shall see how well amuse ourselves, said Ethel, kissing her grandmother. So they looked for a place in the Latin Quarter. They set off early and, walking under the great trees of the Luxembourg or leaning on the balustrades, looked at the palace and the flower beds of the gardens. There were bare-legged babies, nurses beribboned from neck to heel, soldiers in red trousers, a priest in a black gown, gardeners in wooden shoes, young girls without hats, students with hats flat-brimmed. Everything gave them the feeling that they were abroad, far, far away. Such specimens of the pygmy races which 135 vegetate in old countries amused Grandma, and the garden pleased her greatly. This is like Douglas Park except that it hasn't any ornamental mound. Do you remember, Ethel, that globe of earth with continents and seas colored on it in different flowers, and our glorious flag made of white and red pinks and blue corn flowers? Oh, Grandma, for heaven's sake, said Ethel. And yet it's not bad here, continued Grandma. The people are so gay. The soldier's trousers are too short, and the gardener has wooden shoes, but they look gay. Why, I wonder? At the beginning they did not venture into the Latin Quarter without some emotion. On the strength of what they had read and seen at the theater they expected moss-grown houses with flowers in the windows and streets resounding with song, where students and grisettes danced the can-can. Grandma soon got over her mistake, after a narrow escape from being crushed by a tram-car in a thoroughfare which was for all the world like State Street. It's not so bad as I thought, she said enthusiastically. It reminds me of Chicago. In their visits they went up and down an endless number of stairways. Often Grandma stayed below, leaving Ethel to visit the apartments. Houses without elevators, said Grandma. Ethel must be crazy. She waited for Ethel in deep courtyards or sat in concierges' lodges near stoves where cabbage soup was bubbling. More than once, while she was alone in the 136 lodge, someone would come and ask information from her, taking her for the concierge. Once a butcher's boy, with his basket of meat on his arm, opened the door. "Bonjour, ma'am. What will ma'am Gibbon have to déculotte de veau?" But he ran away in a fright at the sight of Mrs. Rower staring at him without answering. Such incidents helped Grandma to pass the time. It was while crossing the Rue Servandoni that they at last found their apartment. An atmosphere of peace seemed to issue forth from the old facade with its immense windows. By the open door they could see a wide stone staircase with a railing of wrought iron. A great tree shaded the silent courtyard. The placard was out, "Apartment to let," so they entered. The apartment was at once magnificent and simple, all in white with lines of gold, and carved doors surmounted by painted panels. The street itself had a certain air of tranquil distinction. One of its extremities seemed barred by the austere walls of the old Luxembourg Palace, and the other by the enormous apse of St. Sulpice, with its statue of St. Paul upright on a pedestal between two columns. "My favorite saint," said Ethel, who did not believe in cold and passionless perfection, but in struggles for the best, with tears undoing faults. "St. Paul himself keeps guard over the end of the street. How happy we shall be here, Grandma, and well heat ourselves with wood fires and be lighted with candles," she added with the joy of a child. "We found a real gem of an apartment," Ethel 137 said to the Comtesse de Dungeon that very evening at her 5 o'clock, which was at 4. "Imagine, madam, a door covered with carving through which you go underneath Medusa heads and cornucopias. We shall burn oil lamps and candles that will make us wish to wear flounces and dress our hair la belle poule. And to play il plute burger on a spinet." The Countess interrupted. "Where did you discover such a gem of an apartment?" "In the Rue Servandoni," said Ethel. "I know," said the Countess. "It's near St. Sulpice. And, by the way, dear Miss Rower, if you wish any bric-a-brac to furnish your shelves, I can recommend you a precious man, a great connoisseur and a distinguished critic, a journalist of the good cause, M. Caracal." "Thank you so much, madam. M. Caracal would be very useful to me," Miss Rower had answered. "He's a friend of the Duke of Morgania and of your fellow countryman, Mr. Phil Longueville, whom you are acquainted with perhaps." "Only by name," Ethel said. "The Duke and Mr. Longueville are coming here today, I believe. I will present them to you if you wish." They were in the great salon in the half-darkness of the silken curtains. Although it was broad daylight outside, lighted lamps shed a yellow glow and sparkled amid the glass of the chandeliers and the gold frames of paintings. A valet announced 2 ladies, Mme and Mlle de Gregine. The Countess hastened toward them. 138. Ethel was looking vaguely into the depths of the room. 2 other visitors came in, talking together like friends. His Highness the Duke of Morgania. Monsieur Phil Longueville. 139. Chapter 12. Ethel's idea of a man. As a consequence of their meeting, Ethel became Phil's pupil. Having made his acquaintance at the Comtesse de Dungeon's, she gave him a chance, as Grandma had told her to do. She ordered from him 2 pictures according to ideas of her own. First, Eugenie young and beautiful, present in the Emperor's cabinet at the reception of Rower, the grandfather. Then Miss Rower had him paint Eugenie aged and broken, seated by the window and looking far away on the empty place of the Tuileries. Better and better satisfied, she ordered from him Grandma's and her own portrait. These orders were enough to launch Phil, as they say, and brought him other orders from the society frequented by Miss Rower. Ethel, before she came to Phil, had been working in the École des Beaux-Arts, but there the studio seemed gloomy to her and she stifled in it. Moreover, she was already rather tired of the Latin Quarter on account of her fellow countrymen whom she met there. She had a grudge against some of them for imitating and even exaggerating the most foolish faults of a certain class of students. She did not approve their wearing their hair like a horse's mane, their velvet trousers 140 and knit woolen jackets, and their way of carrying around with them boxes and brushes and canvases as if they were sign painters. And when she saw them seated on the curbstone terraces before cafes, drinking in public and spitting everywhere and puffing the smoke of their cigarettes into the faces of the passers-by, it exasperated her. She had a desire to call out to them, "Up, and go to work." As she did not like the art academies of the quarter, she decided for Phil's studio. She had another reason for doing this. The École des Beaux-Arts was too near, and Ethel needed exercise. In spite of the enormous distance to Phil's studio, she always went to it on foot. "To keep myself in training," she said. She came back the same way to give herself an appetite. Thus every morning she had 4 hours work and 2 hours walk just to keep in shape. Ethel, one morning, was at the studio with MLLE, Yvonne de Gregine. The model's rest was over and they are beginning work again. The concierge, the old man of my time and former inspector of the Louvre roofs, mounted the table and posed before the girls dressed as a Louis Quinze marquis. There was a pushing about of easels and chairs. Pallets were taken up, and at once the model was beset with remarks. Modeled head. Modeled foot. Model's mill. At this formal injunction the concierge bridled up, distorted his eyes, twisted his lips, and swelled out his neck like a goiter. 141. Ethel and MLLE, Yvonne, were not working from the Louis Quinze model. Helia posed for them in a corner of the studio's corner of still life. She happened to be free that morning, as the figure of Morgana which Phil was painting from her was nearly finished. Helia had come down to the pupil's studio to please Ethel, who greatly desired to do a head of the Madonna from her. Ethel and MLLE, Yvonne chatted together as they added touches to their watercolors. Ethel was relating to her friend, Yvonne de Gregine, the visit she had paid some time before to Phil's private studio, where she had seen the Duke of Morgana. She had also described the magnificent decorative painting which Phil was finishing for the Duke. Their conversation was punctuated here and there by the remarks cried out around them to the Louis Quinze marquis. Modeled eye. Modeled mouth. Really, said Ethel, that concierge is incorrigible. Why does he persist in not looking like the students' drawings? MLLE de Gregine at Ethel's side laughed heartily. How droll you are. Helia smiled in spite of herself. The papers keep me in good humor, Ethel answered. I venture there's something in them again about Richard the Lion-Hearted, she continued, pointing to a paper on the chair. All sorts of bargains are offered to me ever since that store, usually old mummies. 142. No, there is nothing about Richard today, Ethel remarked, as she ran through the headlines. But she received her pinprick all the same. In an open letter someone attacked American society and the lack of solidity in its family tea, signed H. Oxenmalsalettsfabriken tea. This annoyed Miss Rover more than personal attack. She was amazed that people could have such thoughts about her country. In your country, was the conclusion of the Salatsfabrikant. The young men run after money and the young women after titles. Personally, I had the idea that titles were running after me, thought Ethel, who had had reasons for believing so during the 3 months in which the Duke had been paying her court. She had already forgotten the open letter, but she kept on thinking of the subject it had started up in her mind. Ah, certainly not. Titles were not to be her aim in life. Most of all, since her visit to the Empress, she had promised herself to give worldly grandeurs only the esteem they deserve. A title no more takes from a man's qualities than it adds to them. The main thing for a man is not to be a duke or prince. It is, first and foremost, to be a man. MLLE. Yvonne was also painting a Madonna's head from Helia. She wished to make a medallion of it as a present for her mother. Helia took pleasure in posing for these girls who were so kind to her. Ethel, after seeing Helia at Phil's the day after the Quat's Arts Ball, had met her several times and felt a 143 very sincere sympathy for her. She seemed to her to be the right sort of girl. She had even proposed to send her to Chicago as a professor of physical training in the women's university founded by her father. The situation was brilliant, her future would be assured, and she would probably make a very good marriage before long. Helia thanked her effusively, but something kept her in Paris, and she added, Paris alone gives the consecration to artistes. Ethel knew that Helia was preparing a number which was to make a sensation. Meanwhile, she had her little sister, and, so it seemed, was paying for the old clown cemetery out of pure goodness of soul. For the time being she was pinched for money. Ethel would have been happy to do her a kindness, but she knew that Helia would never accept anything under any form whatsoever, not even a gift to Surette. A smile, yes. A kind word, yes. An obligation, no. It was the same with Suzanne, the model who sometimes posed for pupils and whose acquaintance Ethel had also made. This simplicity of manners, which was at the foundation of their race, touched Ethel. She pardoned the pygmies many things for the sake of these brave little hearts. An acrobat and a model had matters. Character is everything. Model time. Rest. There was a noise of pallets laid aside and pupils rising in their places. The old marquis telescoped his neck into his laces and came down from the table. You who are collecting mummies, Yvonne de Gregine 144 said, laughing, to Ethel, you ought to add the concierge. He is a type. Don't laugh, Yvonne, said Ethel. He would do very well in our hall in Chicago. He'd give it an air of the old regime. There are heaps of men like that in princely ante-rooms. Painting was over and they were now talking in the still life corner. Of the other students, some were walking 2 by 2, some were standing, and others seated on the high stools, and some were grouped about MLLE, Yvonne and Ethel, who was, in a way, their leader by the social position she held, and the prestige of her name. All around her they conversed as in a parlor, amusing themselves with the passing broil between the English Miss Arabella and MLLE, Yvonne. England should not allow it, Miss Arabella had exclaimed, speaking of some performance of French politics. French affairs concern us alone, MLLE, Yvonne, usually so timid, had retorted as she raised her head whereon her hair was rolled like a helmet. Miss Rosencrantz, a Swede with spectacles, made peace as if by chance with her explanation of a new association in Stockholm, the Women's Anti-Marriage League. What are its articles? Miss Rower asked. Absolute indifference to men-woman by herself in all and for all meetings, lectures to girls, mutual aid unions. Ethel, who was their leader. Conversation followed in which the Anti-Marriage League was discussed. On such subjects MLLE, Yvonne 147 did not speak. She listened with astonishment to these young women from the countries of the north talking among themselves of things on which she never touched. Marriage and Anti-Marriage League clubs. Of all this she was ignorant. MLLE, Yvonne was passing 2 months in Paris. It was the Comtesse de Dungeon, a friend of the Gregine family, who had introduced her to Miss Rower. The 2 young women were unlike both in education and ideas, and they at once became great friends. But MLLE, Yvonne was shortly to return to her old tranquil provincial home, and she was enjoying her last weeks in Paris. Today, especially, she was delighted to hear them talking freely before her, and, most of all, about marriage. For her it was the escapade of a school girl looking over the wall at the fruits of a forbidden garden. One thing, however, was troubling her. Her mother had not come back, as she always did, to take her home. Doubtless there was some unforeseen hindrance. She confided her disquiet to Ethel. Don't worry, your mother will come, and even if she does not, you can go away alone, I suppose. What, said Yvonne, cross Paris all alone? You wouldn't think of it. But I do it. That is true, Yvonne said, blushing. They were speaking in a low tone. The others were not listening, but surrounded Miss Rosencrantz. What is more natural than to go about alone? Ethel said to Yvonne. What harm is there? Voyons 148. You slander your fellow countrymen. Men of Paris are not tigers, I imagine. What danger is there? Oh, none, Yvonne admitted, but they are said to be so gallant. Gallant? An ill-bred fellow accosts you in the street and you say he is gallant? Not exactly, no, Yvonne hastened to say. It's just the contrary. Men such as that, said Ethel, are not men at all. There was a moment of silence. Men who are not meant. That must be another of Miss Ethel's pleasantries, thought Yvonne. Ethel looked at her watercolor, throwing back her shoulders to judge better of the effect. What she did not understand was that a young woman like Yvonne should accommodate herself to such a state of affairs. Yvonne, who but now, during the squabble with Miss Arabella, had the decided air of some Gaulish Amazon. Why should she be so timid with regard to such insolent dogs? She felt really a lofty and protecting pity for this sister of an old country, nice as she was. Men such as that, she began again, in a tone of contempt. Such as what? Yvonne timidly asked. Do you mean workmen, men with blouses, hose of whom you were just speaking? Hose who are not. Who said anything like that? Replied Ethel. Dress has nothing to do with it. It's their profession. Then, Yvonne asked again. 149. Or is it nationality? The Englishman is different from the Frenchman. German. Oxen also let's fabric tea. Ethel interrupted. All go to make up so many different types. I know, MLLE, Yvonne continued. It's nothing of all that, said Ethel, seriously. When I say a man, I speak neither of an officer nor of a lawyer nor of a doctor nor a workman nor a prince, rich or poor, German, English, or French. It doesn't matter. The students had gathered round. They asked one another what Miss Rower meant. Who, then, is the rara avis that is neither this nor that, not a workman, not a prince? Helia kept silence and listened. Which man? She had known one who seemed to her frank and loyal and gave her his word, and then he had forgotten it. What meaning, then, was there in Miss Rover's words? But she understood perfectly, and she blushed for Phil when Ethel, to signify those qualities of uprightness, equity, and honor, that respect for one's word once given, which she meant by man, repeated in a tone of deepest conviction. I say amen. 151. Part 2. More Than Queen. 153. Chapter 1. Wanted a Duchess. As he had himself said to Ethel the day of his visit to Phil's studio, Conrad di Tagliaferro, Duke of Morgana, was much to be pitied. He had to quit Paris. The Duke reveled in the life of the boulevard, losing himself amid the crowd, climbing to the tops of omnibuses, taking a cab to the opera, getting himself spoken of in the society news of the papers. He was seen everywhere, in salons and at the theater, at the clubs and at the races. There was no ceremony for him, and he had no cares. Arriving in Paris, he put aside all the duties of his position, as you might leave a coat in the cloak-room. When he accepted a friend's invitation, he always insisted that there should be no questions of etiquette. Sans ceremony, it's understood, and he would add in Parisian slang, au hasard de la fourchette, pot luck. However, there was a but. His people pestered him from afar in the shape of 2 voivodes who had been delegated by his nobles, and who followed him even to his late suppers like some twofold banquo spectre. 154 These delegates were in Paris to urge his return. The Duke had been lucky enough to avoid them until now, but their mere presence said clearly enough that things were going wrong in Morgana. Since the fabulous days of Morgana, the unity of this little warlike people had always been kept at its frontier, beneath the shadow of its great red banner with the white cross facing barbarism, and it was from that side the storm was muttering once again. There were grave reports from Macedonia. Houses were being burned and convoys pillaged. All the villages from Kosovo to Monastir were in ebullition. Bands of Bashi Bazouks had come as far as the Dina. It would be necessary to go back. The Duke saw it clearly. Great events were preparing. You were present, I believe, the Duke said to Caracal, when I spoke at Phil's place of the old sorceress, who is a prophetess for some and a saint for others, and has more influence in the country than all the journalists in the world could have. This old woman predicts the future, I assure you, Caracal. She foretells astonishing things, absolutely amazing, and I myself have seen them realized many times over. Just now she is upsetting the country with talk about the return of Morgana. But there's no harm in that, Caracal remarked. She excites the people, and it will end in war, that's all, answered the Duke gravely. Ah, the prophetess and her prophecies, they are a load upon my back, I can tell you. Why don't you shut her up in a madhouse? 155. That's more easily said than done, observed the Duke. An old woman adored by an entire people who may not believe me, but I assure you she's stronger than I. Caracal looked at the Duke to see if he was in earnest, but a Duke's psychology was entirely beyond his ken. Subtle observer as he was, the Duke's animosity against the sorceress had a look of embroilment between sovereigns. While the prospect of all these troubles alienated the Duke from Morgana, so a creature dear to his heart attracted him homeward. This was his only child, his son, the little Duke Adalbert. All the Duke's affections were centered upon this son. After the death of the Duchess, it had not been a happy marriage. First of all, his wife had made him take a dislike to his people. She was an Austrian archduchess more than an aristocrat, an Olympian, and the fall from the elegance of Vienna life to severe duties in Morgana filled her with bitterness. She detested her subjects, and they paid her back the compliment. Never had a duchess been so unpopular. Until then, not to speak of the heroine who had founded the glory of the house, all the duchesses had had the gift of pleasing the people, perhaps because most of them were themselves sprung from the people. Love's fancies had reigned in the house of Tagliaferro, and, thanks to such spontaneousness of feeling, misalliances had not been rare. Just as at the Austrian court Archduke Henry, the emperor's nephew, had espoused a dancing girl who became Baroness Waldeck, 156, and before him Archduke John had married the pretty Anna Plöckl, a postmaster's daughter. So the Dukes of Morgana, with aristocratic loftiness, chose their consorts wherever it seemed good to them. Such duchesses the people of Morgana preferred to all others. It was very important for the future of the house that she who was to succeed the mother of Adalbert should possess all those qualities which make a woman adorable: goodness, beauty, and valor. In Morgania, where diplomatic refinements were unknown, there was needed a young woman of new blood, bringing energy with her, and able to revive confidence. There had been such in the ancestry of Duke Conrad Derwin, sprung from the people, daughters of the mountain or the plain. "You shall see their statues," the Duke said one day to Ethel, who had come with her grandmother to see his collections. "It is if you do me the honor of stopping in Morgania when you make your Mediterranean yacht tour." "It is a promise," said Ethel. "It will interest you, Miss Rover, to visit my stronghold. It is one of the most ancient in Europe. The donjon at the entrance is formidable. It was in 1221, when he returned from the crusade of Honorius III and Andrew II, King of Hungary, that my ancestor Enuernd had it built, along with the great hall used for the people's assemblages. For to procure the necessary resources of his expedition, he had been obliged to enfranchise the serfs." "He did well," observed Grandma 157. "He could not have done better," the Duke replied. "Moreover, there came out of it the hall, which is a masterpiece. The hall, doubtless, is decorated with the arms and armor of the epic. That will interest me greatly." "There are neither cuirasses nor gauntlets," answered the Duke, "neither helmets nor the armor of knights on horseback, as in the Tower of London or the Invalids in Paris. But such as it is, it will interest you even more. It has something that will go straight to your heart." "Really?" Ethel asked. "And what can that be?" "This," the Duke went on. "The Walhalla of Bavaria has been built to German heroes. Our hall is built to the glory, not of the heroes, but of the heroines of Morgania. My ancestor Enuernd consecrated his hall to the glorification of our women." "Ah!" Ethel exclaimed, deeply interested. "A great idea," said Grandma. "America ought to have a hall like that at Lincoln Park. We have our heroines, too. 'Twould be full in little time." "Madame Rover is right," said the Duke. "To be a heroine there is no need to fight sword in hand. The fulfillment of the civil and moral virtues makes heroines, and devotedness and love have their own martyrs. But I am going to show you an old engraving of the hall." The Duke rose and searched in a portfolio. "Two characteristic features," he continued, "strike one in feudalism: individual energy and improvement. 158 in the condition of women. When Duke Enuernd went forth to look for war and adventures, my ancestress Bertha remained in Morgania as the Duke's representative, clothed with the right of administering justice, and charged, during his absence, with the defense and honor of the country. Such sovereign power often gave to the women of that time virtues which they had no opportunity of exercising otherwise. When the knights and men at arms were gone to the Holy Land, only the women remained at home. Then Hungary was invaded by the Mongols, who ravaged everything down to the Adriatic. Morgania was on the point of perishing, but Bertha, the horsewoman, as the people called her ever after, scoured the country the whole winter long, leading convoys, and bringing in supplies from Italy and mercenaries from Germany. Thus she repelled the Mongols and saved Morgania from invasion and the people from famine. When the Duke came back he found Morgania in mourning, for the Duchess had died at her task. Saint Morgana, the heroic ancestress, already had her altars. The Duke wished to consecrate the glory of the others as well, and he built the hall so that henceforth the people might gather around their images under the saint's protection. Dying, he expressed a wish that his descendants should dedicate the hall to the glory of their women. "Here is the engraving," the Duke said, turning toward Miss Rover and Grandma. "Here is the engraving." "Indeed," said Ethel, "all this interests me tremendously." 161 So your ancestor Enuernd was the creator of women's rights. Ethel and Grandma examined the engraving. It represented an octagonal hall of somber and massive aspect. The 8 segments of the vaulted roof were separated by stone ribbing that met in a fleuron, from which hung an immense chandelier. The arches rested on 8 columns. Between 2 of these a solid wall had been built. It was covered with vestiges of ancient painting. Stone steps mounted up to this wall, making a platform on which there was a bench of carved wood. "Let me be your guide," said the Duke. "This large wooden bench against the wall between the 2 columns is the ducal throne. The stuffs and cushions which cover it were brought from Tyre and Sidon by Enuernd." "That is very beautiful," Ethel interrupted, "but it is your heroines that interest me most. Where are they in all this?" "Bertha, the horsewoman, where is she?" "Bertha's statue," the Duke replied. "As you see, there are 3 statues facing each other. First Bertha, then Hilda, the Duchess who killed Sultan Murad Akroja with her own hand, and then Rhodes the slave. The 4th pedestal is still empty." "Was there a slave in your ancestry?" Ethel asked. "It is the name you apply to Rhodes." "She was the daughter of a simple voivode," said the Duke. She accompanied to Venice the daughter of the King of Hungary, whose kingdom had partly fallen 162 under the power of the Turks, but they were attacked by an Ottoman galley and everyone was massacred except Rhodes. As she trampled the crescent underfoot, they chained her to the rower's bench, from which she escaped only by a shipwreck. She came back to Morgania, had the Duke buy a galley in Venice, chose a crew of hardy corsairs, and began a war without mercy against the Turks who infested the coast. She put herself at the service of Don Juan of Austria at the Battle of Lepanto. My ancestor, Hugh XIII, made her his Duchess, and Philip II of Spain, as a recompense of her valor, gave her the hereditary title, unknown till. That was a woman, Ethel said. With the Duchess like Rhodes a people could not perish, but Morgana, the fairy, the saint, in whose honor the hall was built, I do not see her. On the contrary, she is everywhere. She lights up the hall with her rays, the Duke replied. This engraving does not give the entrance portal which overlooks city and sea and country. This portal was made at Enuran's return. It is like the entrance to an enchanted palace, and by its magnificence and delicate ornamentation contrasts with the general severity of the hall. As in Gothic churches, this portal sets far back into the interior. An immense stained glass window overlooks it, and from this light falls in floods through one of the sides of the vaulted roof, which was purposely suppressed. I understand, Ethel said, face to face with the ducal throne. Your ancestress Morgana dominates everything. 163. Yes, continued the Duke. At eventide the setting sun enters the interior of the hall through this window, which represents the glorious martyrdom of Morgana. You would say that her blood threw crimson stains upon the throne itself, and the glow of her miracle lighted up the whole hall. What about the fresco which has left traces on the wall behind the throne? Was it too of some warlike deed? Ethel asked. No, this one represented the legend of Morgana rising from the sea and bringing in her arms what should be the fortune of Morgania. What was it she was bringing in her arms? I know not. Morgana, it appears, was represented in the fresco issuing from the sea and covered with seaweed. Just as in the picture of Monsieur Phil, remarked Ethel. Exactly so, said the Duke. It was the moment I chose, and your fellow countryman has reconstructed it. In my next trip to Morgania, Monsieur Phil is to come to the castle and finish his picture on the spot. Before then I shall have time to search through the archives, and perhaps I shall find what it was Morgana was bringing in her arms. Thereupon Miss Rover and Grandma went away. The Duke remained alone. He retired to his studio den plastered with sporting photographs and, sinking on a sofa, lighted a cigarette and began dreaming as he followed the light smoke with his eye. Morgana, who was to come forth from the sea bringing fortune and happiness in her arms, is it not Miss Rover landing in her yacht before the 164 castle? She too comes from the setting sun. She too brings fortune. She too would be adored by the people. What a strange coincidence. The old sorceress is not so crazy after all, the Duke said to himself, and there is nothing impossible in it. Whatever may be the personal qualities and fabulous fortune of Miss Rover, a Duke Tagliaferro is her equal. Through me she would be Duchess of Morgania, Protectress of the Sky Petters, Lady Knight of Malta, Princess of Croja, Queen of Antioch and the Holy Land, allied to the court of Prussia and cousin of the Habsburgs. There is not an older nor a nobler house in Europe. It made the Duke's head swim only to think of it. He was a descendant of Hugh, the Frankish chief to whom Theodosius had given one of his 12 duchies of the West, and since that time nothing, not even Attila's torrent, nor the Turks, nor Charles the V, nor so many famines, nor so many wars, nothing had ever struck the sword from the hands of his ancestors, nothing save the anger of the people against Duke Ademar, who was driven from the throne because he had delivered up Morgana. I will maintain by the sword. This proud device had never proved false, as the old iron-bound archives could witness. The Duke felt weary with all the weariness, and old with all the age of all his ancestors, and his fingers had scarcely the strength to knock the ashes from his cigarette. What a youth his inheritance of glory had won for him! How he had envied in other days the little peasants who ran barefoot along the beach, whereas 165 he, brought up by sad-faced priests in the old feudal castle, was less free than a slave. Then came his marriage, which had been settled for him for reasons of state, and the death of his father, which gave him the administration of the duchy, an ungrateful task. No, he had not lived. Enough of the gloomy palace and rude peasants. He wished to live and to be amused, to be young for once in his life. He would know happiness, at least. The Duke gazed at the blue curls of smoke floating as aimlessly as himself. He had not even hoped for a marriage like this with Miss Rover, having all the advantages of a royal marriage without any of its inconveniences. She would be one of the richest and most brilliant sovereigns of Europe. Never had life appeared sweeter to him than now. He was buoyed up with hope and illusions. There was this marriage for the near future, and meanwhile he could enjoy the little time he still had to pass in Paris. This evening, for instance, he was to go with Caracal and meet Helia behind the scenes of the nouveau cirque. Perhaps he was thinking more than he ought of Helia, but he wished to thank her before his departure for having posed as Morgana. A lackey broke in upon his reverie, handing the Duke 2 cartes de visite on a silver plate. Zrnitka. Jalopalici. The devil, said the Duke. My 2 voivodes, my 2 killjoys. Ah, those 2 sad-faced ambassadors of the sorceress ruled 166. They never cease harassing him. The valet spoke. The gentlemen wish to have the honor of presenting their homage to Monseigneur. Yes, I am acquainted with their homage, the Duke said below his voice as he drew out his watch. 6:30, and Caracal is waiting for me and Helia, whom I have to see. What answer shall I give these gentlemen? Asked the valet. How do I know? Answered the Duke, vexed at being troubled while thinking of so many things. Tell them I am having a political interview tete-a-tete with the representative of a great power. 167. Chapter 2. A Parisian Debut. The Duke, imposing and superb, was present, and Caracal, with his monocle in his eye, was beside him. It was the first night of Helia. If it had been a common first night at the Théâtre Français, the Duke would have thought himself dishonored by appearing before the second act, but he wished to offer a rose to Helia, and so he, a gentleman, had committed and made Caracal commit an unheard of thing. He had dined between 7 and 8 so as to arrive on time. You are interested in behind the scenes? Your presence greatly honors us, Monseigneur, said the director of the cirque as he passed by them. Was he interested? He was more than Faith was enthralled. First of all, Caracal suggested it was very chic to have the air of paying court to Helia, who tomorrow would be celebrated as a star. This would give an irresistible Don Juan mark to his ducal title. That will help me with Miss Rover, thought the Duke, who was pupil and plaything of the clever 168 Caracal. There was a single shadow in his picture. Phil was not there. Phil was to accompany Miss Rover to the American Club exhibition, but this touched the Duccio so very slightly. Miss Rover had a great esteem for Phil, but pshaw, a poor devil of an artist was no rival for him. A duke with his duchy, descended from fairies and queens and saints. Against all this, what could avail her innocent flirtation with Phil? The public had not yet come and the hall was empty. Here and there the electric globes were lighting up, but the Duke and Caracal beheld a sight which helped them to pass the time. The sensational equestrienne, the Marquesa de Guerrera, was coming down the steps, enameled and rouged and resplendent with diamonds. Monseigneur gallantly held her stirrup as she painfully climbed upon her horse. She dashed out on the track in front of the empty benches for a short rehearsal. She asked for the orchestra and the lights to accustom her horse to the noise and glitter. She was afraid he would take fright. She trembled at his slightest shying. Take away that white paper that program on the bench. Take it away, and do you applaud? The Marquesa called to the stable boys who approached the ring. Applaud, to accustom him to the bravos. The horse began turning like a great mechanical plaything with a doll on its back. The horse does all the work, said Suzanne behind the Duke. She had just arrived with Helia and Sarette, Helia's little sister. 169. Giving the flower to the child. 171. No, I assure you, said Helia, haute riding is difficult. The Duke turned. How do you do, mesdemoiselles, he said, lifting his hat. Monseigneur, Helia began. Oh, Monsieur, Sarette broke in, it's for me. Isn't it, the pretty rose? Oui, wise, the Duke answered, giving the flower to the child. He remarked Helia's surprise. She seemed troubled by his visit. It had been the affair of a moment, but it was sufficient to hinder the Duke, who was no apt pupil of Caracal, from giving the rose to Helia. You lack nerve, Caracal whispered in his ear. It will come, answered Monseigneur. I see the Duke and Caracal, Helia said to herself, but Phil is not here. It's not very nice of him. The public was coming in. The equestrienne left off rehearsing, with her head over one ear. Come, we have to get ready, said Helia. Au revoir, messieurs. The benches were filling up. Against the dark shadows of the boxes, fans waved to and fro. The Duke straightened up in the respectful space which his title of Monsignor left around him. Near him was Cemetery, the clown, waiting for Helia, whom he was to accompany in the ring. He shook the yellow tresses of his wig and groaned constantly, complaining of his aches and speaking of a return to his box to rub himself with camphorated alcohol. 172. "Do you want me to go with you? I'll rub you," the Duke said, Parisian to the fingertips, and hoping, if he rubbed the old clown's spine, that he would redeem in Caracal's eyes the rose given to Surette. "No, thank you, Monsignor. There is nothing to be done," said the old clown. "I too was famous, and now am only an old doga." But no one listened to him. The show began. In the ring, the blonde hair and doll face of Louise Bingle whirled to the music of the orchestra as she leaned over to apply the whip to her horse's neck with many a go and up. The public talked as it looked through the program. The real show was to come later. It was not the Gallinaro family, somersaults, bravo turnaround, tappy tumblers, nor Miss Soho, the world's greatest I don't know what, nor Princess Colibri and her prince consort. No, that which attracted the public was, first and foremost, Helia. Discreet notes in the papers had given hopes that there would be something never seen before. Some said she was a young girl of good family, whom an irresistible vocation had drawn to the circus. Details, too, were given of her career in contradiction with one another, of course. What was not known, though, was how Helia had been working for months. She was going to try a daring feat. Even the costume was to be new. To her, the nudity of the male, it seemed brutal. Cemetery. Beauty is well, talent is better. Cemetery, her professor in other days used to say, and she wished to be applauded for her art and not for her beauty. 175. Her wonderful gymnastic knowledge gave her the right to attempt the feat. She thought in gestures. She had in her the inborn love of grace and physical force. With graceful movement she summed up 1,000 things which she could not have said, and she had the idea of reviving the acrobatics of the ancients just as others have reconstructed the songs of old times and the dance through the ages. One day at the Louvre she had seen on a Greek vase an artistic dance which struck her. She had spoken of it to Phil while posing for Morgana, for Helia saw Phil often. In spite of all, she loved to be near him, and though Phil might forget, on her side she felt her love for him only increase. She was one of those proud hearts which love but once. In spite of all, she believed in the sacredness of a sworn promise. Phil would come back to her. Besides, Phil was a precious help in the work she was undertaking. Together they consulted the researches historiques et critiques sur les mimes et pantomimes du Seigneur de Rivry. Her head was full of neurobody, shoinobody, and acrobody. She dreamed of gymnastics and the dance. She studied her movements in Phil's studio. In the evening, after his work, he had a jointed lay figure which she put in the proper poses, seeking for effects in its curving and bending back. She cut out little costumes and tried them on it. She went to the library and looked through the boxes of the booksellers along the quays. The instinct of the beautiful guided her. She composed her number as she might compose a poem. 176. The reverse of a Roman medal and an old engraving representing the Genoese who descended the towers of Notre Dame, torch in hand, to offer a crown to Queen Isabeau, suggested ideas to her. A biography of Madame Sacqui, who was called the first acrobat of the empire and whom Napoleon entitled Mon Enrigi, was very useful to her. Plato, Phil said to her one day when they were studying together. Plato contends that gymnastics give grace to the movements of the body, of which we ought to think even before adorning the mind. Plato is wrong, was Helia's answer. But she proved that he was right by the moral energy which physical training had developed in her. For months she studied without let-up, mastering rebellious muscles, beginning again 20 times over the same thing, setting to work with all her heart and all her courage, with clenched teeth and eyes shining with the pride of will. There was despair in her mad energy. "But you will kill yourself, Helia," Phil said to her. "Nonsense," said Helia. "I will die or do it." In other days, she thought in her simplicity, Phil did not like to hear me speaking of my trade, but who knows, he may change if I become a grande artiste. That evening she was to present to the public the outcome of her efforts. Suzanne, in the dress of a pretty little pirate, was already in the ring. With her usual go she was showing off trained rabbits. They jumped through 177 hoops, climbed up on her, and ate seeds from her hand. It made a little interlude before Helia's number. At the entrance of the stables clowns and firemen, reporters and men of sport made up a guard of honor. There was even an impresario from New York who spoke to Suzanne when she came out. Brava, mademoiselle. Ah, if you only knew how to sing. If I only knew how to sing. G to coot. Brava, brava. You'll have a success in New York. You'll come on the stage, they'll ask you if you know how to sing and you'll answer how was it you said it? G to coot. I hear you. That's it. You must also bring in a little concando. You know how to dance? There's a question for you. And with the point of her elegant foot, Suzanne, scarcely seeming to touch it, sent the shining silk hat of the impresario rolling on the ground. Brava. Perfect. The impresario cried in an ecstasy of joy. I've found what I'm looking for, a typical French girl. There was silence. In the luminous void of the circus, high up in the air there were shining things in nickel trapezes and a rope was stretched down to the ring. The orchestra burst forth. Helia kissed Suzanne and passed out with a run before the Duke and Caracal. Her mantle, left hanging as if by chance, gave a glimpse of a rosy shoulder. On the threshold of the 178 ring she stopped and threw off the mantle. It was like the unveiling of a statue. She wore the short tunic of the dancers of Pergamus. The clinging stuff was fastened at the shoulder and hung to a point on each side, leaving arms and neck and the upper part of the breast uncovered. A light skirt fell straight to the ankles. Helia looked at the public long enough to smile and bow. Then, with a quick spring, she leaped to the tightly stretched rope and with agile bare feet climbed up its incline to the platform in front of her trapeze. The light brought out the whiteness of her skin and her red cheeks and glittered back from a little star-shaped jewel in the black hair above her forehead. There was a murmur of sympathy. The public applauded and cried, "Brava!" Helia had done nothing yet, but the audience was already won. The orchestra, after a moment's silence, suddenly broke forth and Helia began. At first, to accustom the public to the notion of the movements, she leaped upright on the trapeze, which swung over to the platform. This had been foreseen. The three trapezes in their swing almost touched each other. They were hung from light steel tubes and oscillated like a single mechanism, without break or twist. Helia, with infinite grace, went through a few exercises. It was the waking of the goddess, the first astonished gestures of a statue called to life by the inspiration of a Pygmalion. Then she let herself fall 179 as if overcome by dizziness, grasped the bar as she slipped down without apparent shock, and almost before the folds of her gown could fall back gracefully was again on the trapeze, magnificent and at her ease. She balanced herself gently and gave a backward leap to the platform. The public broke forth in applause. It felt itself in the presence of a healthy and robust art. This was no acrobat limited to one single task, with legs heavy by dint of walking on the ball, or shoulders by walking on the hands. But here was the accomplished gymnast, all-round artiste, with her muscles obedient and supple. In her they acclaimed the poetry of the body and the melody of movement. To give Helia a moment's rest, Cemetery entered, stumbled at the entrance of the ring, fell on his nose, rolled over, and pulled himself up by the rope. His pantomime expressed delight and fear at the spectacle, high above him, of this creature of light and beauty. His pursed-up mouth and rounded eyes had the look of weeping. He walked out scratching his wig. The public laughed. Helia made a sign and looked to the trapezes oscillating. Suddenly, to a joyous strain, she leaped forward. The orchestra seemed to uphold her in her flight. Nothing could be more graceful than the pose of her skirt, which fluttered from her ankles like a pair of wings. Then Helia leaped to the second trapeze just as the two bars almost touched. Her hand grasped the steel tube with a sudden effort which 180 her art concealed. Then, letting go, she continued her dizzy balancing and leaped to the third trapeze, as calm as fortune on her wheel. She had crossed the entire space of the circus at a single flight and fallen upright on the other platform just as a wingless victory finds rest on the pediment of a temple. Hurrah! Brava! Brava! Helia cast a look of triumph on the crowd. What an artiste, the Duke murmured. Could this really be she who but a moment ago was talking like any comradithus prodigy who was holding the hall enthralled and bringing in a crush to the door all the stable crowd and artistes, gentlemen in evening dress, and the whole tumult of clowns? Suzanne looked at her big sister in wonder and delight, while her lips seemed to murmur a prayer. Cemetery entered the ring again to proclaim the distress of man and his unrealizable desires. He jumped up to the rope, climbed a yard or two, and fell back flat on the ground. Come on, the goddess seemed to say to him. He tried again, but from the height of his Olympus the leader of the orchestra thundered him down with a stroke of the bass drum, and he fell again, remaining on his back with his forelimbs wriggling in the air. Then he dragged himself away, broken and bruised, with halting leg and rubbing his shoulder, while above him Helia appeared as an apparition, a shining form rid of the heaviness of the flesh. At the circus. Her art astonished the public. There was no perceptible effort, jarret latches, high leaps, whirls. Their 183 was nothing of all that. She gave the sensation of the something never seen before, merely by the way in which she touched her trapeze with the point of her bare feet. One felt that she was free from relace, inventive, a genius. It was youth and beauty, scorn of danger, and courage holding spellbound the crowd below her. Her artistic intelligence profited even by obstacles. Thus Helia disdained the net, but the law imposed it. She found a means of making it serve her own purposes. Just as she was ending, a globe was passed up to her, and she placed it on the bar. Then she stood upright on it. In the vast oscillations of the trapeze, she was like a goddess soaring in space with the earth under her feet. Then Helia stopped motionless. The orchestra ceased, the lights were extinguished, and suddenly, like a star falling in the night, Helia fell down to the net. There was a moment's anguish, and then the lights and orchestra, lightning and thunder began again. As in a storm, Helia was on the ground, offering with a gesture her heart to the crowd. She was called back again and again. Bouquets were thrown to her. The public would have her out once more. At last she retired, worn out, and, putting off her stage smile, she shook hands all round. "There'll be no bouquets left for the Marquesa," Suzanne said, "but her horse may be accustomed by this time to the bravos." "You must be tired, Mademoiselle Helia?" the Duke asked. 184. "It's my trade," said Helia. "We smile to the public all the same. It would not be nice to show that it is work." And, with a gracious salutation to the Duke, she went back to her dressing room. "You haven't invited her to supper," Caracal remarked to the Duke when she had gone. "I didn't think of it. Are you going to wait till she comes down?" "No," said the Duke, intimidated. "I shall see her later, I hope. Your valet must attend to it. Let's go now. There's nothing to see after Helia." 185. Chapter 3. Phil, champion of Miss Rorer. "I'll send her some flowers tomorrow," the Duke said once they were outside. "Monseigneur," replied Caracal, "allow me to tell you, you've been below the mark all through." "That's so," agreed Monseigneur. "For a reigning duke," Caracal went on, "a grand seigneur, a Parisian in soul, to have such timidity. It was worthwhile dining at impossible hours and passing evenings with a rheumatic clown, to wind up in nothing." "I shall have my revenge," the Duke said. "This evening I did not dare. And the reason is this," Caracal continued. "You're in love with Helia." "Yes, Monseigneur." "What an idea." Just then Caracal passed into the two-colored light of an apothecary's shop, red on one side and green on the other. His single eyeglass darted a fantastic reflection on the Duke. He might have been twin brother to Mephistopheles. 186. "What a devil of a man," thought the Duke. "You can hide nothing from him. He might easily be right." Caracal had not astonished him. In love? Perhaps he was, since others were noticing it. It is true that Caracal was not exactly others, powerful psychologist and searcher of hearts and brains as he was. But even Caracal would have to confess himself beaten by a Duke of Morgania parading with a circus star that would be Parisian enough. He would no longer accuse him of inheriting the prejudices of Morgania, nor of believing in the predictions of the mad old witch. The Duke blushed at his own scruples. He envied Caracal's effrontery. "It is true," he said to himself. "I have been below the mark all through. For a grand seigneur like me to be as timid as a college boy is absurd. Helia ought to be for me simply an episodia pantomimed, nothing more." All these ideas had come to him while he was lighting his cigarette, and Caracal, red and green, was darting on him the reflection of his monocle. "In love with Helia?" the Duke said aloud, flattered that Caracal had such an opinion of him. "Ma foi, why not?" "You are quite right," answered Caracal. "It will increase your prestige. Besides, you'll see her at supper. My valet will hand her the invitation. Helia would rather go off alone, but she will come with us. Phil will be of the party too." 187. "Well, come along. We have an hour to wait. Let's go in somewhere," said the Duke. They were just coming into the Place Blanche. A café, through its open doors, wrapped them round with the smell of alcohol. Before them a red-winged mill seemed grinding fire and flame. Beyond, streets went climbing up Montmartre, mountain of guano, right and left. Along the boulevard, incredible dens held out their blazing signs in line, like the mean, tekel, a parson of monstrous nights. "Here is a cabaret artistique. Let's go in," said Caracal. "It's immense." "Come on," assented the Duke. The atmosphere, as of a den of animals, caught them by the throat. The conversations were deafening, but the voice of the proprietor rose above the clamor. He welcomed visitors, even ladies, with a torrent of insults. It was the height of chic to receive his avalanche of insolence with a smiling face. "What do these two carrion come for?" he cried, pointing to Caracal and the Duke, who, in his surprise, was on the point of getting angry, to the great joy of the public. "Let's sit in this corner, we can talk better," Caracal said to him, as much at his ease in this asphyxiating air as a fish in water. They sat down, and the brutal voice and the clamors of the public found occupation elsewhere. "Talk?" asked the Duke. "What in the world should we talk about here?" "About Helia," answered Caracal. "Here's to your 188 amours, Monseigneur," and he raised the glass which a waiter, dressed like an academician, had brought him. "Caracal," said the Duke, laughing, "we no longer live in the times when kings espoused shepherdesses. But dukes, Monseigneur, still pay their court to duchesses," Caracal went on. "It's a tendency of the aristocracy." "Why?" asked the Duke. "Because the common run of men, when they court a woman, make account of what others think of her, whereas a grand seigneur doesn't care for the opinion of the public and chooses what pleases him." "That's true," said the Duke. "I can cite you a dozen examples," Caracal continued. "There's Clotilde Loiset, the circus rider, who is an Hungarian princess today. Shelley, the Duchess, married to a Russian count who is minister of state. Lord Billy, betrothed to an equilibrist. The Countess of Lansfield, Baroness Rosenthal. You know well who they were, and you see what they are now, thanks to the caprice of some highness. Grandees, Monseigneur, are like those kings who acknowledge no rank but that which they themselves create." "Well said, Caracal." The Duke, when his first surprise had passed, found it amusing to talk confidentially in such a moral pig pen. It was so amusing, even, that he forgot to ask himself what possible interest Caracal could have to see him in love with Helia. 189. "Will you come now, Caracal? Phil must be waiting for us." "Helia too," said Caracal. They left the place. "We are leaving just as it is becoming interesting," Caracal sighed. "It's over there we are to meet," he added, pointing to the terrace of a cafe inundated with light. They had not gone 20 steps before a voice called to them. It was Phil's. "Good evening, Monsieur le Duc." "Good evening, Caracal." "Good evening, Phil," answered Caracal. "Eh bien, how's your American club exposition? Interesting painting in the grand style." "American painting, done by machinery, of course. I don't say that for you, cher ami." "And how's your novel?" "The House of Glass," retorted Phil, leaving painting for literature. "You were just now in search of human documents." "Don't say no. I saw you. You're always thinking about it?" "Always, my dear friend, always." "But what makes you think so?" "Because you were looking in the gutter," said Phil. Caracal made a grimace, but when they got to the cafe his self-love had a satisfaction which brought back his smiles. Before the terrace, encumbered with people, his valet was awaiting him, telegrams in hand. This valet was a part of his pride of life, a good fellow employed in a shop all day long, and 193 in the evening. Caracal dressed him up in a tail coat with gilt buttons and a high hat, and had him bring his correspondence to the cafe every night, as if he were a man overwhelmed with invitations and billets due. "Mademoiselle Helia will not come this evening," the valet announced. "Why not?" Caracal asked, interrupting the reading of his dispatches, which he had good reasons for knowing by heart. Mademoiselle Helia did not say why. Mademoiselle only said that she would not come. She has gone out with Socrate. "Very well," said Caracal, dismissing his valet. "With Socrate. Poor Helia," thought Phil. "Well, messers, it will be less gay without a lady," Caracal observed. "But since we are here, let's do Montmartre, will you?" "Come with us," said the Duke. So all three did Montmartre. Caracal knew it all thoroughly. The cabaret was his home. He entered offhand. He had his own manner of opening the door and bidding a friendly good day to the proprietor amid the tables. "There's Caracal." These words, pronounced in the smoke of these little cafes by some decadent accompanied by a painted girl, swelled his heart with pride. Even the Duke envied him this quasi-royalty which Paris confers on its elect. Caracal loved the cabaret Rosses, where some rickety little monsieur advances on the platform, opens 191 his snarling mouth and, hammering his words that not a syllable may be lost, narrates his little nastiness to the public. It's a new school, Caracal explained, much more advanced than the decadence. It's educating the public up to itself little by little. It has taken frankly for its flag the exact word in all its crudity. Say, rather, the dirty word, said Phil. Wherever they went there was the same atmosphere of infection. You would have said that camping in modern Paris. There was a Vilchot of the Middle Ages, where Verolles Terprecio made high festival with ribald companions. The look of the places was repulsive. In one they were served by mock galley slaves dragging their chains behind them. In another there were grave diggers, and they sat by coffins, and green flames burned inside of skulls. You, fever patient, what do you take? The waiter said to the customer. And you, consumptive, what do you drink? Moribund. And then the fever patient or the moribund, some ruddy young man from Scotland would answer timidly, Un Bach. That gives a high idea of Paris, Phil said, as they went out. To him it all seemed stupid. What a contrast for him, after an evening passed with Ethel, were these pestiferous dives with their brute public like pigs at the fattening. The pitiful sight recalled to him the weak-willed days of the past, the evenings at the Deux Maggots, the masterpieces drawn in pencil on café tables and wiped off with a rag. 192. Caracal made a study of the different cabarets, preferring this one to that and drawing a dilettante's distinctions between their poets and singers. Such an one enunciates well. Have you heard his ballad of the drunkard and the rotting dog? That is art. And with an elegant gesture he fixed the monocle in his eye. Phil examined Caracal and tried to discern in his face the low instincts, the hatreds, the thumb marks of degeneracy. He saw nothing but self-satisfaction. They had arrived at the Pustule, the latest cabaret artistique. Let's go in, Caracal proposed. It shall be the last. I shall leave you afterward, said Phil. They entered. A blonde girl, with a thin, colorless voice and childish gestures and little smirks, was singing. Les baskets du bois de Boulogne. Aus quan fait zizi pan pan. Her place was taken by a chansonnier Ross, fat and bald. This one began at once, in an aggressive tone, a political satire. What? There was a couplet against Americans, Richard the Lion-Hearted again, and then a direct allusion to a certain American miss in this sewer. Phil rose up, pale with anger. He would have smashed things and shut the mouth of the fat brute bellowing on the stage. But suddenly he thought that 195 he might compromise Miss Rower. He sat down, clenching his fist. I'd like to know who writes such infamous songs, he said to Caracal. Bah, never mind. Calm yourself, Caracal answered, with sudden uneasiness. Never mind, it's not worthwhile. No one understands. What a set of fools, Phil went on. I'm going away. I choke here. Well, go with you, added the Duke of Morgania. A moment later Phil took his leave of the Duke and Caracal to return home. From the other side of the street he saw Caracal gesticulating and explaining modern art to the Duke. Fragmentary sentences reached his ear. Chansonniers Rossoff with all masks, the future of poetry, patrie voix vous, just like the rose sprouts from the dunghill. 196. Chapter 4. Twixt Dog and Poet. Phil went his way, leaving the Duke and Caracal behind him. He was angry with himself for having come. Especially he was frightened at the feeling which had just been urging him to punish the singer on the stage. There was something more in it than the natural indignation of an upright heart in presence of a low action. He felt it 100 times more than he would have done for a personal insult. He stood forth revealed to himself as the champion of Miss Rower. On the whole, the verses were stupid rather than malignant, but it had been stronger than he, an explosion, in a way, of a growing passion. He resolved to stop short on this dangerous descent and not allow himself to be lured on by an impossible love, the very thought of which seemed to him worthy of blame. Phil was not content with his evening, so well begun and so ill-ended. They'll not catch me again doing Montmartre with Caracal and the Duke, he said to himself. I was wrong to go there tonight. I have become certain that Helia is letting herself be courted by Socrate. To have 197 come down like that whom I knew so reserved and sweet. And I know something else too. I have to stop flirting with Miss Rower, perhaps even stop seeing her. Poor fool that I am. And Phil went his way with lowered head, absorbed in his own reflections. Phil's idea was right so far as Miss Rover was concerned. He might really have been in danger, but he was mistaken in his appreciation of Helia, for she had not quit the circus with Socrate. Socrate had followed her. That was all. Suzanne having taken away Cirette immediately after the departure of the Duke and Caracal, Helia, worn out with fatigue, went away much later on the arm of Old Cemetery. She was full of deference for the man who had made her an artiste, and she accompanied him back to his hotel. Socrate walked alongside, without the least emotion at the sight of this Antigone protecting her Duchess. Rather, he was furious that she should lose her time with such a dotard, but he had nothing to say about it. Helia would not have understood, and Socrate remembered spitefully that the Duke and Caracal were cooling their heels in vain expectation of her. Afterwards Socrate saw her home. He had so many things to say to her, things he dared not utter. However, at the moment of taking leave he expressed a wish to go in order to speak more freely. "No, thank you," said Helia. "You would wake Cirette, who is already in bed." But 198. "Besides, you have your own work," and she shut the door in his face. Socrate, in a rage, remained outside. What he could not say this evening he would say tomorrow. So be it. But that he, Socrate, poet, thinker, painter, sculptor, and musician, would be so treated by this little mountebank, a humiliation. He felt that he wanted to break something. A wandering dog passed by, and with all his strength he gave him a kick in the ribs. "There, put that in your pocket. And you take that." And Socrate received a heavy blow, with which he rolled to the ground. It seemed to him as he fell that he flung out his arms to protect himself, and that his fist came in contact with a head. When he was stretched out on the pavement he saw standing on the curbstone a man, motionless and looking at him. They were both in the light of a street lamp. Suddenly Socrate recognized Phil. In fact, Phil had been coming down the street just as Socrate kicked the poor animal. In his indignation Phil punished the brute, and then immediately recognized in him Socrate, who, of course, so he thought, was coming from Helia. Socrate would have jumped on Phil, but he had neither knife nor revolver, so he remained on the pavement, crazy with impotent rage. Phil, remaining calm, picked up his hat, which had fallen in the scuffle. He waited, but as the thinker contented himself with groaning, he went his way without even a look behind. "Helia, Helia," he thought within himself, "that you should receive such a creature." 199. Suddenly Socrate recognized Phil. 201. Chapter 5. Little Sister of A Star. The next day Helia was still sleeping when Cirette aroused her. The little one was trotting along the carpet in her bare feet, talking and laughing to herself in the sunny room. It was her great happiness in the morning to be up first and take her big sister by surprise. She climbed on the bed and awoke her with a good kiss on the cheek. "Ah, how you frightened me!" cried Helia, pretending fear. Cirette burst into laughter. "Let me lie beside you. I'll let you sleep." "Are you sleeping?" the little one asked a moment later. "Ah, you see, you're not sleeping. Eh bien, tell me a story." "You know," replied Helia, "if you're not good you shan't do the trapeze today." This threat quieted Cirette. Helia did not wish to make a gymnast of her. Ah, no, she dreamed of other things for her, nothing except that. But she had taught her a few turns to develop her, and the little girl took the greatest pleasure in it. 202. Soon, won by the warmth of the bed, Cirette fell asleep. Helia arose gently and finished waking herself with an invigorating bath in cold water. Then she put on her great peignoir, tying the girdle around her waist. To keep herself supple she went through 2 or 3 of her flexions, bending herself backward, forward, turning her bust on her haunches, breathing again and again long and deep. The sleeves of her peignoir flew loose as she raised her arms, like a statuette from Tanagra come to life. Then she finished dressing, for she hated wrappers in which the body grows soft. She put on her apron and made tea in the samovar which Phil had given her, just as he had given Suzanne a splendid salad bowl. Tea was Helia's triumph, as Suzanne's was salad. There was no disputing it. The concierge brought up the fresh bread, the butter and buns, and she cut her tartines thinking of other things. She would put aside savings for Cirette. She would teach her, have her taught the piano. She scarcely knew hat but not her own trade. The beginnings were too hard, yet if it had not been for her profession would she ever have known Phil? It would have been better not, perhaps. Who knows? She owed him great joy and grief as well. To think that he had not come to see her first night at the cirque. The idea came to her that she might never live out her love romance to the end, and her heart swelled within her. But with a gesture she put away these haunting thoughts and finished preparing the bread and butter. When the breakfast was ready, she awoke her little sister. 203. Up, and quickly, dear one, the tea is ready. Surette jumped from the bed, stuck her little feet into her big sister's slippers, and did not linger playing on the carpet. Seated on a chair made higher by a great book which she would go to turning over presently, she already had her nose in her cup. Her favorite doll, Glanrhyd, was at Phil's studio. He was to repaint the face, which had been damaged by a fall. Other dolls were lying on the floor, but they were not Glanrhyd. Glanrhyd had been given her by Helia, who had cherished it ever since her own childhood. In spite of its absence, Surette was greatly preoccupied with her bread and butter and tea. She had scarcely the time to smile at her big sister and ask her questions. What is taffeta metal? Helia had just been taking out of her trunk and hanging on the wall mementos of her life, to which she was much attached. Her little sister was not acquainted with these objects. And that, Surette ran on, pointing to a gilt paper wreath, to a group of gymnasts with Helia in the foreground, to still other things. And that, she added, pointing to the photograph of a young girl seated on a kind of throne with a young man at her feet. It's you and Phil, Surette remarked. That might be, answered Helia. Eat in peace, and keep quiet. No, tell me first what that is, Surette asked, pointing to another photograph. Barracks in a garden. 204. It's not barracks, Surette. It's the palace of the Duchess of Glanrhyd near London. Is it the doll's palace? No, Helia said, but the Duchess gave me the doll. Do you know the Duchess? When I was in England long ago, I played in her park at a benefit for the Society for the Protection of Children and Prevention of Cruelty to the Weak. Oh, what is that? Tell me. Protection of children, Surette demanded. I can't explain to you. You would not understand. Helia looked at the photograph and remembered the day. I will send you a pretty present, the Duchess had said to her, caressing her with her gloved hand. And, in fact, to Kennington Avenue, where Helia was then living with Cemetery, they brought her a magnificent doll and pounds of bonbons. But Helia enjoyed neither them nor the doll. It will fatten you, Cemetery said, as he locked up the bonbons. There is no strength in them. He put the doll in a cupboard, adding, you have no time to play either, except on Sunday. Come to work. Say, big sister, asked Surette, who was finishing her bun, what is cruelty to children, and is there cruelty to big persons? Tell me. Come and kiss me. You will know later on. And now, go and play. Say, big sister, Glanrhyd doesn't come back. Must I write to her? Write if you wish, darling. 205. To whom shall I write? 207. This was quite an affair. Surette prepared her table behind a screen in the doll's room, but the paper was too large. Glanrhyd would never be able to read it. Helia had to cut it down to the proper size. At last, having got seated, Surette, by way of introduction, stuck out her tongue, rolled her head from right to left, and began. Well, Surette is busy, Helia said to herself. She will leave me a little peace. Say, big sister, does a doll answer? I don't think so, said Helia. Will Monsieur Phil answer? Surette asked. Let Monsieur Phil alone. He has something else to do. But, big sister, it used to be always Phil here and Phil there. You weren't afraid to speak of him. Well, I won't have it, Helia replied after a moment's silence. Why? Because. To whom shall I write, then? I don't know, my darling. Surette reflected for a moment, biting her penholder. How do you write little Jesus? Is it one word or two words? Good, thought Helia. Now she's writing to the little Jesus. But someone came to divert their attention. There was a knock at the door, and Socrate came in with a cheek red and limping slightly. 208. Helia asked what was the matter. Oh, last evening, after leaving you, I had a fall. It is nothing, Socrate hastened to say, not wishing to tell of his affair with Phil, and for a good reason. You must have hit something hard, Helia said. Oh, Socrate went on, in a rage at his red cheek and limping leg. Oh, why are you always spoiling that little girl? Cakes and dolls. Cakes only fatten her, and dolls are good only for Sunday. Helia was struck by the remark which brought back word for word Cemetery's observations. It was of no importance, of course. It was one of Socrates' jokes. The proof was that he was smiling, but it displeased Helia, who had become very reserved with him and distrusted him a little. She esteemed him only for the nature of his work. It seemed to Helia that by taking interest in and intelligence she redeemed in some way the roughness of her trade as a gymnast. She raised herself in her own eyes, so she helped Socrates, half through charity and half out of pride. Socrates, knowing Helia's goodness, looked forward to the time when he should have supplanted in her heart the remembrance of Phil. But he soon discovered Helia's real feelings, and was all the angrier because he had to hide his wrath when he described to her the plan of his next poem, or the picture that he was always going to do. He was thinking all the while of other things than his pictures and poems. What? He was not to be the husband of Helia, she was to marry someone else, and he, Socrates, would not have the signing of contracts with her directors, 209 the discussing of prices, and the pocketing of the money. Someone else was to enjoy all that? What a pleasant life his would be if he should marry Helia. Oh, it was very simple. First of all, had set Surette to work steady. They might give her bonbons and dolls. They would all go under lock and key, and then to work in the morning, while he would go to the cafe and take his eye-opener. Helia and the little one would do their dumbbells to get underway for rehearsal, and then used 3 hours exercise in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. Then he would show what was in him. He would encourage with a gesture or threaten with a look. Sometimes he might let fall a very good for Helia, or a doesn't go begin again for the little one. In his conception of himself as professor, he had always a cigar between his teeth, diamond buttons on his cuffs. To think that he was not to be Helia's husband, the very idea made him turn over in his head all sorts of sinister projects. Socrates tried to be friendly with Surette. "Good day, MLLE, princess. Will you kiss me, MLLE, princess?" "No," Surette answered. "Your red cheek makes me afraid. You look like a bogeyman." Now, Surette," Helia said. "Be polite, darling." Socrates fell down. It wasn't his fault. Don't you know that poets walk along looking at the stars? 210. Not at the stars, but at one star. MLLE, Helia, you know the one I mean. "Now you are here, Socrates, you can do me a favor," Helia interrupted, not even listening to his compliments. "First throw these letters for me into the waste basket." "Must I throw that of MLLE la princess also? What is she writing there? Can I see?" "No," Surette answered. "Is it a secret?" "Well, I won't insist," Socrates said, and straightway stretched his neck over the screen and read. "To the little Jesus, they say, little Jesus, that up there in heaven you have a wonderful bazaar, with all the playthings which are in all the earth and some that are not. There is no doubt of it. Little Jesus, is there? Well, then, cure Glanrhead and send me a little white dog, a curly one that barks. I'd like to have a doll dressed for her wedding, and a little china table service, and let it be pretty, very pretty." A letter to little Jesus, Socrates thought to himself. There's a letter which won't be delivered. Meanwhile Helia was reading her morning's mail. There was nothing new in it. She had received hundreds of such letters. "Mademoiselle, pardon me, if I dare, mademoiselle, will you allow and admire of your talent and your beauty," and so on, and so forth. Helia did not even read them through to the end. She blushed, not with shame, but with pity for such foolish adorers. "Do they take me for a toy?" Into the basket, and she held out the letters to Socrates. 211. Why, she is crazy, Socrates thought. All these letters, they'd be magnificent for blackmailing. "You do wrong to destroy them," Socrates said aloud. "Some of them are, perhaps, in earnest." "How is that?" Helia said, looking at him. "What do you mean?" "Inui." Helia's uprightness disarmed him. She would never understand anything. Was it possible to be so naive? Socrates was exasperated by it. "By dint of shutting yourself out from everybody, you'll soon have no more friends," he said, trying to be insinuating. "Who knows if there's not a letter from the Duke there?" "And what then?" Helia said, as she arose. "He is, perhaps, your best friend," Socrates answered, "a powerful protector like him." "What?" "Of course, next to Monsieur Phil," he went on, with the perspiration starting out on his forehead. "But Monsieur Phil is too busy, they say," even, and Socrates hunted for a word with which to end his embarrassment, and he had to be inventive and prompt. "What is it they say?" Helia asked. "That he is going to marry." Helia had too great a habit of controlling her nerves, too much mastery of herself, and too much pride to show her pain. Socrates had not the pleasure of seeing her turn pale. She appeared to be taken up with Suzanne in her corner. "Of course," was Helia's reply. "And now do this 212 errand for me, will you, Socrates? Here is the money," she added, explaining what she wished. "Pow, and keep what's left over." She accompanied him to the door. Her limbs were trembling and she seemed to walk on cotton. There was a roaring in her ears. She turned and fell into a chair. Phil was to marry. Everything seemed crumbling around her. Her dreams for the future, her castles in Spain, burying her in their ruins. She could never recover from such a blow. In vain had she been long awaiting it. She would never have believed it possible that Phil, so gentle and good, would do her such harm. For him too, she had then been but a toy. He had amused himself with her. He had sworn marriage to her, and because she was poor and needed to work at a trade which she had not chosen. Oh, no, because she earned her living in a circus. They had the right to look down on her, so she belonged to the public. They could buy a ticket at the door and talk love to her between the acts for a pastime, while oaths, yes, oaths, taking heaven for witness, the oaths which were sworn. Helia pronounced the last words aloud in a tone of indignation. Suzanne looked up. She saw her big sister put her head in her hands and weep silently. For some time she had found that her sister was no longer the same. Her child's memory recalled to her a Helia full of joy and talking always of Phil. A Helia who drew a circle with her pen at the end of her letters after applying her lips to the spot. A Helia who told 213 her beautiful stories and played and danced her in her arms, which were so firm and gentle that she would have cast herself into them from a belfry with closed eyes. Suzanne tried to understand. Her little brain divined something without knowing exactly what. First, they did not often see Monsieur Phil. He was always very kind to her, Monsieur Phil, and yet every time her big sister saw him she was sad afterward. Why? Socrates too made Helia sad. She was in trouble when he went away. What had he been saying to her? And Phil especially. What had he been doing to her big sister? Helia raised her head. She was as worn out as after her most violent efforts. The suffering calmed her revolted pride. Suzanne saw her lie back in her chair and close her eyes as if to sleep. But Helia did not sleep. During those moments she saw again her entire life, that gloomy childhood in which she could count her happy days, and then her youth, in which Phil had loved her. Had she acted wrongly? What had she done that could displease him? Perhaps it was a mistake to keep on in her trade. But how was she to live? Phil was to have taken her out of it, and he had not done so, and she meanwhile had been so proud to be an artiste, believing that she would become his equal. Poor fool that she had been. Yes, it must be that Phil, the student, was her equal, the Phil who was now tasting GL. No, 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 it is not possible, Helia murmured 214 as she sat upright in her chair. No, I know Phil is a man. If he had done that, he would turn away his head when he sees me, or he would come to ask my forgiveness on his knees. But after the oath which he had sworn me, to act like that without shame and without remorse, say no. Socrates is lying. Suzanne said nothing. Her instinct told her that all this did not concern her, that her business was to keep quiet, and that big sisters have cares which she could not understand. But she saw that Helia was in trouble, in great trouble, and Suzanne wished to see her full of joy, as she had once been. Her good little heart had a touching inspiration. She drew a mark across her letter and ended it up as follows. Little Jesus, keep your playthings for the poor, but tell Phil to be good to my big sister, who used to play all the while and tell me stories. Make him to be not so wicked, for she cries often when she speaks about him. I put my kiss here for you, little Jesus. And Suzanne did as she had seen Helia do. Before slipping the letter into the envelope she placed a kiss at the end of it, and made a circle with her pen all around the spot. 215. Chapter 6. The old story. An automobile, with Miss Rover's brother Will conducting it himself, was rolling slowly along. Will had just arrived from America to rest in France from the worries of business. He had bought for his sister this magnificent 40-horsepower machine, and, with a chauffeur to indicate the way for him, he had the pleasure of taking Ethel and Grandma for a ride through Paris. That day, on the seats behind him, there were his sister and Grandma, and, facing them, the Duke of Morgania alone. "Oh, there's Monsieur Phil," Miss Rover said, as the auto stopped at a crossing thronged with hucksters and good wives in morning undress. "Good day, Monsieur Phil." Phil was on the sidewalk 2 steps from Miss Rover. He was in his studio dress, a short coat over his sweater. He had come out to buy something and was going home with a package done up in paper in his hand. Hearing his name, he raised his head, recognized Miss Rover, bowed, and then approached in visible embarrassment. The visor of his cap ill-concealed the eye which Socrate had chanced to blacken with his fist the night before. 216. Our friend Phil does his own marketing, Ethel said, laughing. He is right. I've heard from the Honorable Mr. Charlie that nothing is equal to a good beefsteak as a plaster for a black eye. Well, I suppose I must tell you, said Phil, not wishing that Miss Rover should think he had fought with a lamp post. This is how it happened. I got it last night while punishing a rough fellow for ill-treating a poor dog. Really? Then get in here with us, I beg of you, said Ethel. Phil excused himself, his dress, his black eye. You're all right as you are, Ethel replied. You'll really oblige me by coming with yous, and she seated him beside the Duke. Your dress doesn't trouble us since it pleases you, she continued. Be yourself, and look out at the world from the neck of a sweater. There'll always be people enough to look loftily over a choker. If I were a man I would always defend the weak and pay no attention to the rest. You're all right as you are, Monsieur Phil. He approached in visible embarrassment. Phil listened to Ethel with intense satisfaction. The Duke chatted with Grandma. The good fellowship which he saw growing up between Miss Rover and Phil did not bother him. It was only the ordinary relations between an American girl and boy, only the friendship of fellow country people. The Duke had for Phil that distant regard which nobles by race have for professionals. To handle a tool, even such as the painter's brush or sculptor's chisel, to do something with one's hands, be it even a masterpiece, lowers a man somewhat. 219 in their consideration. Consequently, Phil might defend strong or weak, or dog martyrs. If it amused him, it was a matter of no importance. The Duke gave himself up to the noble occupation of a cicerone of mark, who knew his Paris thoroughly, and, as the Phil, on his side, talked with Ethel and camarade. As the Duke said, what a pleasure such talks were to him. Where were now his fine resolutions no longer to make himself the champion of Miss Rover, and even to stop seeing her? He drifted along under the charm of her words. From the day when, in the Duke's company, he had first met her at the Comtesse de Dungeon's, he had become one of the faithful at her tea parties. He often went to the Rue Servandoni, and, after the commission for the Empress portrait and Ethel's entrance as a pupil in his studio, they had had the most friendly relations. Phil told her stories from Bohemia that amused her. He narrated his adventures in the provinces, including the Little St. John, with his arrival in Paris and his visit to Poufale and Suzanne, the comrades, and Socrate and the deux Maggots, his reception at the studio, and the welcome on the model's table, and many other things besides. But he said little about Helia's stay in Paris when he was a student. For that matter, he thought of it seldom. His memory was a mist concerning it. It all seemed so far away to him. With what pity he recalled the environment in which he had lived. There were all his chance friends. Suzanne, who was really good, and skeptical only because 220 she had seen too early the bad side of life. Poufale was too simple. To have made an intimate friend of him would have been to tie a cannonball to one's leg. Charlie was too much of a bluffer. As to Helia, he was grateful to her from the bottom of his heart for the simple love which he had once had for her, a love whose remembrance had protected him all through his first years in Paris. For him it had been a romance without reproach, candid and loyal, and not a passion that would follow him through life like a remorse. His romance, Phil was sure of it, had nothing in it that was not noble. Yes, Helia would alw. But time had passed. Helia herself had changed. He saw it clearly during her visit to him in his studio on the morrow of the Quat's Arts Ball. Ah, how far away were the days when she had been his sweetheart, though many things had passed since then. Now Ethel ruled in his life. He felt himself very little in her presence. For her he had the same admiration which Helia once had for him. Miss Rover was the first society girl whom he had known, for he had led a solitary life in the Chesapeake manner, and in Europe his over-timidity had always held him socially aloof. During his years as a student he had neither opportunity nor leisure. It was only now that he began to understand the charm of the social world. The instincts of his good breeding were awakened. Life seemed beginning for him. He felt like a man back 221 from exile. Contact with Miss Rover refined him, and even his art was idealized. It was no longer physical beauty alone which attracted him. There was the moral side, for Ethel put character far above talent, and the two together above everything else. After this automobile ride which his black eye had earned for him, others followed. Usually Will, the brother, was himself the conductor, as a matter of prudence. That intoxication of speed which gives weak minds the illusion of energy was unknown to him. Once, however, he got into the auto with them and allowed the mechanician to take charge. It was a day when Mme de Gregine and MLLE, Yvonne, her daughter, had accepted the invitation to take a ride with them. After that MLLE, Yvonne and her mother returned to their province, so that the most part of the time Ethel and Grandma had the company only of the Duke or Phil, and now and then of M. Caracal. They saw Autoile and Chantilly and took part in an automobile gymkhana for polo at the Bois de Boulogne. At the Longchamps races Miss Rower, like a great favorite, was the target of the field glasses. It was there she met Charlie, faultlessly correct, having stripped himself for the day of his bohemian clothes. Charlie, who knew Ethel, passed in vain near her again and again to have her recognize him. The automobilists were seen everywhere from Versailles to Vincennes. The trip around the world was too commonplace. They made the trip around Paris, passing its 57 gates, past its 10 railways, its 2 waterways, through its 2 forests and more than 30 quartiers, 222 which sum up the luxury and industries of all the cities of the world: London at La Rapée, Chicago at La Villette, Antwerp at the Canal de l'Urque. At St. Denis, Caracal gave them the history of what they were seeing. He showed them the effigies of kings mutilated in the Revolution, at the time when Choisy-le-Roi changed its name to Choisy-sur-Seine and Montmorency to Etienne. Since there were no longer kings or noblesse, things they would have done better to keep, the Duke observed. They would probably still be here if they had been worth keeping, answered Ethel. They dined in a tree at Robinson and rode on donkeys at Romainville. The outings of Parisians in villages with charming names: Marne-la-Coquette, Fontenay-aux-Roses, Les Lilas, were pleasing to Ethel. Space opens up ideas. You will find it so, Monsieur le Duc, and you too, Phil, if you do us the pleasure to hunt the moose on our Canadian lands. How free one feels there, not a hedge, not a barrier between us and the North Pole. Caracal, for his part, cared little about space. He regretted the days when the boulevard was the only promenade. Tramways and railroads seemed to him high treason against Paris, something like an invasion of the corsair of fields and woods into the artistic atmosphere of cafes. No, no, Miss Rower answered. Leave things as they are. A little pure air does no harm. To be sure, said Grandma. Caracal refused to be consoled. 223. If this goes on, he said, Paris will soon be Paris no longer. That something indefinable and apart, that hothouse which has made us the neurasthenic and dislocated skipjacks that we are. Well, if that's your manner of loving Paris, Ethel said, laughing, really, you see things worse than they are. Caracal, perceiving he was on the wrong tack, stopped short. Just the contrary. You ought to be glad for something that is worth more than hygiene and real health. Miss Rower continued. Why should people stay piled together when there is so much empty space around? Tempers are embittered and bodies weakened. Give it space and air and your Paris will cease to be what you would wish it to remain, a hothouse full of dislocated skipjacks and neurasthenics as our up-to-date people are, according to you. That's a good one on Caracal, thought Phil to himself. Will, who was not conducting the auto that day, interrupted Ethel. He spoke little, but he thought and then went straight to the point. Let us pardon Frenchmen because of French women, he said. You are right, Will, replied Ethel. I admire Frenchwomen. They seem so superior to the men, for among the men there are some so mean. Think of Villeklish printing such outrageous things in his newspaper. Really, in his place I should be ashamed of myself. Who is Villeklish, anyway? 224. Hess, a remarkable duelist, answered Caracal. There are already 5 dead men in his trail. What a coward, said Ethel. I would wager that if he were hit with a check, he would apologize to us. Oh, let him alone, said Will. He does us no harm. The barking dog doesn't bite. Hess, annoying all the same. If it were my own case I would silence him, Caracal declared. But could you do it? asked Ethel. It would be very kind of you to do so. I can't go anywhere at all without hearing Richard the Lion-Hearted with smiles all around me. It haunts me. It almost spoils my stay in Paris. Can you rid me of it, Monsieur Caracal? I shall do so, declared Caracal. I thank you, said Miss Rower. Caracal had just had a bright thought. He knew his friend Villeklish would do whatever he wished since the blackmailing scheme against the rovers had not succeeded and no check had come or would come to close his mouth. It would be just as well to look for something else. Caracal would have himself attacked. He would turn aside the storm to himself by taking up the defense of foreigners, to the apparent indignation of Villeklish. In this noble combat against calumny he would stand forth as a hero in the eyes of Ethel, like a St. George slaying the dragon. The Duke and Phil would have to look out for themselves. He would know how to cover them with ridiculousm and their Helia in some good little newspaper chronique, sweet as honey, which Ethel might read, for that matter. Fie! I will arrange all that this evening with Villeklish, thought Caracal. I shall be well able to pay for a service like that if I marry Miss Ethel. Then aloud, I shall do so. You can count on me, Miss Rover. All this was but one of 1,000 incidents of their trips. I have heard of la dernière salon où l'on cause, the last salon for conversation, Ethel remarked. I suppose it has disappeared. It is so long since people began talking about it. Well, our auto takes its placide is the first auto où l'on cause. When one listens to you, Miss Rover, one can say that wit runs the streets, added Caracal gallantly. Every moment some new observation sprang, bringing out individual character. For instance, a cab passed them noisily, the horse pounding along the street and the driver lashing him. What a noise, Will said. Why are people so obstinate with their hippomobiles? Why not put rubber on the wheels first and then on the horse's shoes? Will calculated the chances of a company to be organized for this purpose. So many horses in Europe, so many horseshoes rubbered, investment of capital so much, revenue so much. They are way behind, said Grandma. What an idea, to be driven about in such dust boxes. What a picture to make, said Phil. That horse just now reared under the rain with a movement as 226 superb as any of the Parthenon. Behind him was that theatrical poster representing a woman with her hair floating with her and the horse. You might imagine a troop of Amazons under the blue sky of Greece. Only artists can enjoy things they know how to see. The poor beast has lost a shoe, and the collar wounds him and the cabman lashes him. Ethel interrupted. Poor animal, it makes me ill to see him. Phil thought to himself, that is what I ought to have seen. Apart from these excursions, he gave to Miss Rover also whatever leisure was left him by his great picture of Morgana. At her request, he accompanied her with Will and Grandma in their visits to museums and to the shops where they wished to buy pictures of the masters for their palace on the Lake Shore Drive in Chicago. Will had first visited the artist studios, thinking he would find there a world free from the atmosphere of business. But the landscape man tried to get him away from the portrait painter, and professional jealousy showed its teeth. They tried to pass off their old stock on him. They spoke only of money. For such a price I will do so and so. If it is larger it will be dearer. A landscape without trees is worth so much, with trees twice as much. If I've got to talk business, Will thought, he'd rather do it with businessmen. And he left the artists alone. Pufail's goods ready for auction. He liked best to choose for himself at the Hotel Drawith, that big collecting sewer of art, rolling pell-mell in its dusty waves masterpieces and daubs. The salesrooms, 229 heaped from ceiling to floor, gave him the feeling that he might sometime make a discovery there, like the cock who found pearls in a dunghill. What horrors, Will said one day, as they were passing in front of a hall full of plaster statues and unframed paintings. It must be from the studio of some poor devil whom they are selling out at auction. There were casts from natural arms and legs and feet. There were formless sketches, canvases hung on the wall. For some, it was impossible to see what they represented, as they had been hung head downward. There was a tub, some bottles, a few chairs, a mattress, and a rickety table, all heaped up in a corner. Two monstrous statues seemed to keep watch over the confusion. On the pedestal of one was inscribed Liberty, and she raised arms and head furiously. The second, Fraternity, lay on the ground in fragments, turning enormous haunches to the public. What are those mastodons there? Will asked. That, said Phil with surprise. That must be from a sculptor whose name is Pufail. Yes, look at the sign over the door, Vent Pufail. Poor Pufail, said Phil to himself. He must have been unable to pay his rent. Landlord has come down on him. If I had known, I might have helped, but it is so long since I have seen him. What he saw recalled the day when he entered the sculptor's place on his arrival in Paris. He remembered the gay laughter of Suzanne from the top of her ladder and the pork fried with garlic. Those statues, those pictures worthy to figure in a collection of horrors. How 230 much more ugly and more lamentable still it all seemed to him in the presence of the crowd of indifferent passers-by. Puffail? Ethel asked with interest. Is it the Puffail of whom you used to tell me? Why, he has no talent. He'd do better as a farmer. The sale began and they heard the auctioneer above the confusion of the throng. Magnificent statues, Liberty Fraternity, give me a bid. 40 sous. 40 sous? There's half a ton of plaster there. Come, now, a higher bid. A silence, and then someone called 50 sous. Bid it up 1,000 francs. Will, Ethel said to her brother. Really, now, Ethel, Will answered. Even at 50 sous it's dear. I'll buy something else from M. Puffail some other time. So many years of toil and want, and all his poor dreams of the future soon to be scattered and ground to mortar. Puffail was right. He had followed his dream. He had tried his fortune. It had tumbled to the ground, but what a beautiful dream it had been all the same. And Phil thought, with a thrill at his heart, that there was one thing which justified every effort, one thing which broke down distinctions and made a poor artist the equal of a reigning duke, of a king even, something which would put him on a level with Ethel, something which he would reach, had he to kill himself in the struggle for it. Ethel came up to Phil as they were going out of the hall. 231. Tell me, Phil, what can induce a man like Puffail to try art? Isn't it sheer folly? No, Miss Rower, it is true Puffail has not succeeded, but that matters little. He has tried to reach the only thing which makes life worth living. What is that, Phil? Fame. 232. Chapter 7. Caracal's narrow escape. Abba Caracal. Vive l'Éclache. Phil, who was reading a newspaper as he passed along, looked up with astonishment. He was in front of the entrance of a music hall. On a strip of cotton cloth he read, in huge letters, Punch d'indignation. The name of L'Éclache was displayed everywhere, mingled with the flags which covered a good half of the theatrical posters of acrobats, jugglers, and clowns. The flag covers the goods, Phil said, as he saw this assemblage of patriotism and fakery. L'Éclache is at his old tricks. What a humbug. Phil stopped. Confused imprecations against impostors and grafters came to his ears between the bang, bang of the door, pushed one way or the other by the public and clanging back into its place. Bang, vive l'Éclache. Bang, Abba, bang, traitors, sold out, bang, Abba Caracal, bang, bang. Hello, said Phil. Abba Caracal, what does that mean? I must go in. 233. He entered. Bang! It was the door slamming after Phil. He had now a right to the indignation and to the punch. To tell the truth, there was little indignation in the hall, but a great deal of drinking and still more laughter. The public was made up of the idlers of the quarter who had come to be amused. There were stable boys and grooms in their great wooden shoes. The hall was infected with the smell of rum and tobacco. The voices, which but now had reached Phil's ear in broken cries, rolled uninterruptedly. There was a continuous torrent of Abba and Vive, mingled with coarse wit and the clink of glasses. On the stage, mastering the tumult, L'Éclache was speaking. Vive l'Éclache. Here, here. Bang. The flights of oratory were lost amid the noise. Only yesterday, L'Éclache was saying, as he raised his voice, not satisfied with attacking the majesty of universal suffrage, forgetful of the famous night of the 13th of March, foreigners feared not to brave the lion people in its den. They banded together to despoil us of our dead. O soil the majesty of the tomb where our great ancestors. Bang, said the door, cutting the discourse. Ancestors sleep their eternal sleep. Do you not hear, O people, beneath the earth? Richard the Lion-hearted roaring with wrath and shame. And to think there are French pens that treat us as visionaries, who point out such attacks and that pretend that we are wanting in courtesy by accusing our passing guests. 234 of an imaginary crime. This vile pen, citizens, I deliver it up to Y. Abba Caracal. Oh, I understand, Phil said to himself. Caracal has taken up the defense of the foreigners, as he promised Miss Rower the other day. Abn Villeklich went on. It shall not be said that Caracal has appealed in vain to our courtesy when he asks us to cease our political campaign against such foreigners, among whom there are ladies and even a young girl. We shall speak no more of Richard the Lion-Hearted. All that is a blunder, a visionary's dream, a groundless accusation. So be it. They ask for definite facts and not for vague accusations. Here is a definite fact. I accuse, formally, an American of stealing our ideas and stifling under the power of his cursed gold the outburst of a young genius, the hope of our glorious national art. They come to pillage even in their calm retreats and to deprive of their labor the sons of the soil's autochtones. Less autochtones. The word intoxicated by Villeklich in his haranguing embroidered his theme with violent gestures which sent the skirts of his coat flying around his thin body. 235. The punch de-indignation. 237. Phil was not sorry to have come. The inventions of this crank amused him, most of all when the orator, rising to higher flights, brought out personal facts so as to enter into the domain of practical things. Villeklich calmed down. The storm-tossed skirts of his coat fell. He was no longer the roaring tribune of the people. He was the statesman, speaking calmly and coolly. He held one hand between the buttons of his waistcoat and the other behind his back, like Napoleon. To begin with, according to him, these facts would never have taken place if they had only listened to him. A quarter of an hour of councils followed, in which there were insurrections and barricades, blood and glory and abat and vive. But if the sword remains in the scabbard, Villeklich concluded, let the people, at least, console despoiled genius with their songs. Let the old Gaulish gaiety inflict its avenging laugh on the robber of its glory. As Villeklich retired amid ironic applause, a long-haired poet came out on the platform and a hurdy-gurdy ground out despairingly such an air as goats dance to. Phil looked at the furious grinder and gave a cry of astonishment. Puffail. What is Puffail doing here, and why does he look so furious? Phil asked himself as he saw the sculptor's wrathful head leaning over the hurdy-gurdy whose crank he turned with rage. Bing, bing. After all, thought Phil, there is nothing strange in Puffail being here. Artists belong to all sorts of provincial and Parisian societies, as if they were really 238 children of the soil. So as to get orders, he might as well grind out a tune at an indignation meeting as Suzanne do the muse of the South at the pig's rump dinner. Phil also knew that the poets of the lands or the broomflower were only too happy to make themselves heard by a Parisian public, and would not miss an occasion for avenging genius despoiled by cowards, and for declaiming in its honor to the accompaniment of a hurdy-gurdy or bagpipes. So it was a very simple thing that Puffail should have offered his services. Meanwhile Villeklich had sat down after many a handshake with the notabilities of the committee. It was now the turn of the poet. The singer on the platform gesticulated to his Norman patois, more monotonous than the fall of rain, while the air of the hurdy-gurdy, piercing and thrilling, filled the hall like a continued wailing from a herd of kids. Enough, cried the public. Be done, Fauchery. To the door. Enough, enough. Silence, Francois. Ta bouch, Bibi. Stow it, I say, Petrusquin. It was the Paragot wit replying to the wit of the provinces. The people had indeed arisen, but not as Villeklich would have wished. Instead of tearing up the paving stones in honor of misunderstood genius, and casting out the robbers of glory, they were content to finish the punch and laugh in the face of the poet who bored them with his doggerel. 239. Besides, all these questions of signatures to pictures, of museum locks picked, and of Richard the Lion-Hearted interested nobody. But the banging of the door now began covering the bing, bing of the tune. The public was going out in a mass. Villeklich tried to keep them by new flights of oratory which had no echo. Phil foresaw that the fierce tribune of the people would soon be making his prophetic gestures and proclaiming the eternal glory of the autochtones alone with his hurdy-gurdy, like St. Anthony with his pig. So Phil went away, followed to the very street by the exasperated grinding of the crank. What madness, Phil said to himself. Puffail is certainly earning his money. He puts as much heat into it as if someone had stolen his own share of glory. Puffail, a despoiled young genius. Phil, at the very idea, could not refrain from laughter. I must wait for him here, he thought. I shall see him when he comes out. He walked back and forth, but Puffail did not come out. Still, Phil lost nothing by waiting. A final bang of the door made him turn his head, and what did he see but, arm in arm and laughing and talking together as gay as schoolboys, Villeklich with Caracal. Well, I never. That's too much, Phil said, as he followed them with his eyes, trying to gather from their gestures the meaning of their conversation. Villeklish lifted his hands as if to show that they were empty. Caracal spoke low to him. Villeklish nodded approvingly. Those fine fellows must be preparing some stroke of 240 business, Phil said to himself, strongly interested. Who knows if I do not play a part in it? It may be my turn and Miss Ethel will no longer hear of Richard the Lion-Hearted. The attacks will now fall on Caracal. Bravo. But perhaps Miss Ethel will not be displeased to learn of the friendship between Caracal and Villeklish. One might have supposed they would not be quite so thick. I don't understand it, was Phil's conclusion. Moreover, he was accustomed never to take seriously what Caracal said or did. Besides, Phil added, Pufale must know what is going on. I have not seen him come out, but he will tell me tonight. So he determined to dine at Mere Michel's, where he would have a chance of seeing Pufale. For a long time he had not met the Copaints. They had almost become strangers to him. The talk about art and the masterpieces traced with a burnt match on grimy tables no longer interested him. He felt himself out of place in the environment, but he wished to see Pufale that very evening. To begin with, he would have the pleasure of offering his services to the poor devil, who could not be very rich, to judge from the sale at the Hotel Drought a few days before. Phil would find some delicate means of being useful to him. Who knows if he would ever see him again? It would be like a farewell to his own past. So Phil went to Mere Michel's. His past mounted up to his brain. It seemed to rise up whole and entire before him when, near the boulevard, in a narrow street, he saw the painted canvas and fixtures deposited at the stage entrance of a circus, the 241 damp courtyard, the frayed walls, the storerooms of stage properties, the theaters inside a salle that was a little of his own past. It was himself, again, whom he elbowed in the boulevard beside the Café des Artistes, where women with red tresses topped with feathers were drinking from little glasses with ill-shaven messers, showing each other photographs and programs, and signing engagements with fingers stiff with rings. Phil could hear their technical slang: cheek de capuri jte fait un bleu and 5-6, garçon, 2 absinthes, and get a move on you, bouger d'andoil. Strolling artists offered to do his portrait for 2 sous. A bohemian imitated an ocarina by swelling out his cheeks. A contortionist spread his little carpet and dislocated himself on the sidewalk. Do you like my trade? He said to Phil, who stood looking at him. If you do, I'll hire you. What a world it is, all the same, and to think that once I loved it all, Phil thought as he turned away. Farther on there was a restaurant still celebrated for the reason that, long ago, my Lord El Arsul had supped there with Cora Pearl. As Phil passed in front of it, he saw the staircase decorated with green palms, and he thought he recognized Helia going up. It was her hat and cloak, and, lifting his eyes, Phil saw, at the window above, the profile of the Duke of Morgania. Phil lowered his head and went his way pensively, leaving behind him the restaurant full of fragrance and lights, wherein the beautiful butterflies of the night were coming to burn their wings. 242. To escape from these mournful visions, Phil called up the remembrance of Ethel. The remainder of his way he traversed without noticing the distance. He had already passed the Seine and gone under the vault of the Institute, following a quiet old street. A moment later he was at Mere Michel's. A volley of enthusiastic cries welcomed him. Phil asked himself if he were not the plaything of a dream. V Phil. Hurrah for Phil. Bravo, Phil. A band for Phil. Pan, 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 pan.